So, it's been about a regular amount of time, by our standards actually, between episodes for once.
Do we really have a regular amount of time?
In theory, we try and do it every couple of months. I know a lot of people prefer that we do it more regularly. We frequently fail, though. So,
yeah, but we've done well this time, I think.
Yes, we have. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mythillogical, the show which is all things myth and folklore. I am Charles. I'm joined by my pet. Was it Lou Garou?
Lou Garou.
Yeah, Cassie. I couldn't think of anything more interesting than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not sure on that description.
No. But we'll see if that comes true over the course of today's episode. Looking at the left of our scripts, we might get all the way to the next full moon, and then we can find out for ourselves.
I don't actually know when the next full moon is.
I don't know. It's not a useful piece of information now that I'm not, a farmer in ancient Rome or something, unfortunately. Or like a random Greek guy who needs to know when the next sacrifice is due. But yeah. So, folks, we're here today. We're going to be talking about what is becoming an increasingly painfully obvious subject from what we've been talking about so far. But before we do that, we've got a couple of little bits of things we want to mention beforehand. And the big thing is that firstly, I want to plug Cassie's continuing spin-off show that you might have been seeing appearing for a couple of episodes now on the podcast feed.
We'll hopefully be on YouTube soon. I'm a little behind.
Yeah.
But getting it sorted soon.
So you've covered Merlin, and you've covered...
So yeah, Merlin's Hidden Treasure in North Wales, and I've covered the Irish legend of the Children of Lear.
Which is kind of adjacent to some of the stuff we were talking about in the Cuchulainn episodes. I keep saying that wrong. It's Cuchulainn, I think, isn't it, rather than Cuchulainn.
We spent 4 hours saying it wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Someone point that out in the comment section. Yeah, so I just want to give that a quick shout out and boost because you're also, I think, in the next month going to be coming out with the YouTube version of it.
Yes, just finalising a bit of the artwork for that.
Yeah, so that's going to be going on its own channel.
Yes.
I believe it's not going to be on the His Scrat channel this time.
We'll make sure there is a link this time in the YouTube description. There wasn't one ready last time.
Yeah, in the YouTube description of both the YouTube description for the video version of this podcast and also like the Spotify stuff like that. And I'll give it a bit of a shout out as well when it goes live on the His Scrat channel. So, in addition to that, we also just want to point out we're going to be doing another sort of spin-off show. It's not really a spin-off of this show. It's just another thing that I'm doing that I thought I'd plug because it is technically a podcast. In the next month, we're going to be starting up a little side podcast, and it's going to be called Curiosity Stop. That's a great start, getting the name wrong. It's going to be called Curiosity Stop. It's going to be me. It's going to be Cassie returning. And it's also going to be friend of the channel, Byron Lewis, who has made a few history-related things on his Scrat channel over the last few years, and also has his own channel, the aptly named Byron Lewis. And we're going to be doing a show looking at weird aspects of history, weird aspects potentially of mythology, if that comes up. Just all weird all the time. That's how we're going to be doing it. And we're going to be shooting our pilot in the next couple of weeks. This might be a video podcast. We're not 100% sure at the moment. We're going to give it a go. And if it turns out we're just horribly non-photogenic, then we will scrap that footage to save the world.
I'm trying to become photogenic.
Yeah.
I'm working on it.
I'm not. But so I just wanted to let you folks know there'll be various announcements and stuff to do with that coming in July. And that'll probably also be going out in YouTube form on the His Scrat channel at some point.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to working with Byron.
Going to be interesting. We'll see how it goes. But yes, that's not what we're here for today, though. Today, we are here to talk about a subject which a lot of people seem to think we have covered at some point. We regularly get YouTube comments saying things like, I could have sworn you did a Werewolves episode at some point.
Yeah, our fans like us so much that they hallucinate whole episodes of us. It's brilliant.
It saves us a lot of work.
We don't have to record things anymore.
Yeah. But yeah, as I said, today's episode, folks, is on werewolves. So it's going to be another two-parter, at least two-parter. We'll see how we get on with the second part. And we're going to be here for quite a while, it looks like. Again, we've got some formidable-sized scripts once again.
Yep, we're being smarter about recording it in that we're actually breaking it to 2 recording sessions after the last episode broke me.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not having another 6-hour recording session or whatever it was, because it turns out talking into a microphone for a long time, it might sound like a really easy job until you actually try and do it.
And when you're voice training as well and it's not going well.
Yeah. And when also half of that time involves you just sitting and listening, and it's like, okay. I'll just sit here like a lemon, I guess.
Nod and smile, Charles. Nod and smile.
Nod and smile. Yes, I definitely am following all this and not ADHDing out. But yeah, so we're going to start out today then, I think, as is only fair, as we generally do for these episodes, by having a quick summary of what a werewolf is. Might seem a bit self-explanatory given how pervasive the idea of werewolves are within Western culture. If you happen to be from a country, though, that does not have any sort of tradition of werewolves, Cassie, you're going to give us a quick overview.
Yes. So the term werewolf is thought to literally mean man-wolf from Old English. It hasn't changed much since it was first coined in the 11th century, the only change being to add a second E to it to ensure that we get the correct pronunciation instead of reading it as werewolf. It refers to a human.
One of them, they're werewolves.
One of them, they're werewolves. It refers to a human, not always a man, despite the term, who shapeshifts into a wolf or a wolf-like creature, either voluntarily or involuntarily. In modern media, it's more common for being a werewolf to be an involuntary condition, a curse afflicted on a human, which forces them to transform, often quite painfully, as we'll see in iconic transformation sequences like An American Werewolf in London, for example, into a wolf or a wolf-like creature, losing their ability to think like a human and instead becoming a ravenous predator driven only by its hunger for human flesh. I say wolf or a wolf-like creature as for most of the 20th century, film and television would depict the transformed werewolf as a bipedal creature with a canine face, sharp claws, a wolf tail, and covered in fur. This is mainly a limitation of practical effects of cinema. This human-wolf hybrid creature is much easier to create without any computer effects than a regular wolf. Doesn't require training like you would require a regular wolf.
Having a real wolf that you've trained sounds like a complication, I would say.
Yeah. Even working with a husky, working with like a husky or something similar as a stand-in for the purposes of like horror and expecting it to act like a predator, that sounds like a lot of difficulty.
Yeah.
And a health and safety nightmare.
Because wolves aren't actually that physically impressive, is the thing, when you look at obviously it's like a really big dog, and it's like, well, yeah, this is a complete tangent already to get us going on the tangents as we always do. My favorite, I think, is like there was, it might have been with the US car company Pontiac or something, once did like an advert where they had to have a tiger involved under like a bonnet of a car or something, like, oh, it's got tiger energy or something. And the way they did this is get a real live tiger in and bribe it with meat to be good for the advert.
Wow.
It was something to do with John DeLorean, who was the guy who had then the notorious flop of the DeLorean car from Back to the Future. But yeah, getting back on topic.
Back on topic. Werewolves, practically, yeah. The human wolf hybrid type creature, as well as overcoming all of those limitations and the issues of tigers in bonnets, apparently. It also gives a much more visceral horror than attempting to make a werewolf look like a regular wolf. It brings that body horror aspect in, as well as the horror of being chased by such a large predator. Mm-hmm. As special effects advanced, we see werewolves becoming more like a true wolf, as in films such as Twilight or TV series such as Hemlock Grove, where this often is combined with removing the curse aspect of the werewolf and instead making it something that the wolves are born as, with this shape-shifting ability and being able to transform at will. Humans that are cursed to be werewolves, usually cursed during a werewolf attack. By surviving a werewolf bite, this caused the curse to be inflicted on the victim. These types of werewolves are often near invulnerable when they're in their wolf form, and the standard way to kill one in fiction requires a silver bullet. This transformation usually occurs on the night of the full moon, doesn't usually require the werewolf to be able to see the moon for it to take effect, or to know what cycle the moon is in. It just happens on that night, regardless. There was one cool exception in the TV show Being Human, where a werewolf who was in a state of delusion from hunger and dehydration tricked his body into transforming with an image of the moon, which was a really interesting way of doing it, and really fun take on a standard trope. Other variations on that, such as, say, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, have the wolf transform for 3 nights, the night of the full moon and the nights before and after. Most of these stories will also have the werewolf unable to remember anything of the previous night when they return to their human form, And so it's quite often used to build suspense by having a character not be aware of whether they are the werewolf or whether it's somebody else.
Yeah. To butt in with my annoying, completely unrelated thing again for the previous section of what you were saying, my reference point to you to like interesting transformations is the Saiyans from Dragon Ball Z, which aren't werewolves, they're like apes.
Were-monkeys.
Were-monkeys. But they have a thing where I think they actually do have to see the moon for it to happen. I remember from the original Dragon Ball, that was the point. Like they can trick themselves by using like an artificial moon as well into it at some point. Of course, if you remove their tail, it's all irrelevant. But you didn't come here to listen to Dragon Ball Z mythology, folks.
That's another show.
Yeah.
It's not ours. The other archetype of werewolves, so werewolves that have control over their shape-shifting, they're either born as werewolves, such as the werewolf packs in Twilight, or can learn magic, which allows them to shapeshift, or use an enchanted item made of wolf fur, such as a belt, which, when worn, affects the change. These types of wolves, they're often stronger than regular wolves, but they're usually vulnerable to regular weapons rather than needing a specific thing like a silver bullet. The characters here usually keep their human consciousness, albeit with heightened senses and understanding of their wolf body so that they can control it naturally. And some will use this like as a superpower for heroic or villainous purposes. Many of these, if they are born werewolves, will also live in wolf pack-like social structures and will have lives that prioritize a connection to nature over modernity, and so are often sort of used with themes of natural world versus modern life. The name werewolf in modern English, as I said before, is descended from the Old English werewolf spelt W-E-R-W-L-F, as opposed to the modern spelling W-E-R-E-W-O-L-F. Most of the contemporary Germanic languages all have similar terms, including werewolf, W-E-E-R, in Middle Dutch, Warwolf, W-A-R-W-U-L-F, in Middle Low German, Weierul, W-A-E-R-U with the circumflex diacritic, I think it's called, L, in Middle Frisian, and Middle High German has the same spelling as the Old English. In modern French, the term loup-garou, which Charles used earlier on, is used. Garou there is derived from the Norman French garwolf, with loup coming from the modern French for wolf. Middle Breton, the language of Brittany in the Middle Ages, used the word bisclavre, which means wolf-sick. Garwolf in Norman French is believed to be a derivative of a Norse word vargolf, which is simply a combination of the words varg and ulf, which both mean wolf, meaning that loup-garou, I think, unless I'm missing something, means wolf, wolf, wolf.
I think when you told me that first time, my response was, well, it's wolves all the way down.
Yeah. If anyone French wants to correct me on all of that etymology, please do. But what I found, that's where it seems to come from. The other common word associated with werewolves today is lycanthrope, to refer to the creature, which would mean a person afflicted with or practicing lycanthropy, the ability to turn into a wolf. This has a lot more specific connotations for werewolf, which is something I think we're discussing in detail in part 2.
I'm going to talk about the origin of that.
Part of your section. Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about part of that today, but we're going to save the medical ramifications of the affliction for part 2.
Cool. With that general information out of the way, we can get into the main body of the episode. Once we've done our references, actually.
Yes.
And then we'll be handing over to you for going back to Paleolithic times.
Yeah, we're going to start early on this one. How we've kind of split things up today is I'm going to talk about the kind of early role of shapeshifters in at least some very early Paleolithic representations of humanity. We're going to then go forward to, we're going to take a bit of a theoretical trip through to the Indo-European times, the Proto-Indo European times, I should say. And then we're going to jump forward to ancient Greece, go all the way through the medieval period and up till the early modern period. Because the first episode of these two, really we're going to focus on the kind of historical development of shapeshifters associated with wolves and what later would be considered werewolves. Now, the second episode is going to be more a case of where did the modern figure of the werewolf come from? Because it's a very different figure. And also, what other type of creatures that are involved with shapeshifting and wolves around the world can we just have a gander at and have some fun with, basically? So something we didn't do, which we normally do, is talk about where we first came across the concept of werewolves. But we have kind of blathered on a bit about all sorts of different cultural things that we know. I was just going to say literally like my earliest like encounter with werewolves just comes from general cultural osmosis, like old films like, you know, The Wolfman, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, stuff like that. And possibly things like the Underworld and Van Helsing movies that were in vogue in the 2000s when I was a wee nipper.
Yeah, I don't remember where I first came across the werewolf. As a avid reader of fantasy fiction and viewer of that kind of TV, it's just always been there for me. But it's an icon. It's a cultural icon, the werewolves, I think.
So to get our sources quickly out of the way, for today's episode, I used the following articles and books in order to back up what I'm actually saying. These are Wolves and Werewolves in Greece by Richard Buxton. Was There a Taboo on Killing Wolves in Rome by Mika Rissanen. The Werewolf in the Ancient World by Daniel Ogden. I'm going to single out the Werewolf in the Ancient World for there's a bit of a problem with our sources, which is, as lamented by many of the academics who've covered this topic, there isn't like a single academic history of werewolves out there that tries to kind of look at these disparate threads from ancient times and pull them all the way through to the modern day. It just doesn't seem to exist currently. The Werewolf in the Ancient World by Daniel Ogden is kind of the closest you're going to get to that sort of thing, but just for like Greek and Roman times and ideas that are associated with the werewolf there. I also used the articles The Werewolf, the Witch and the Warlock, and the Differentiated Werewolf by Willem de Blecourt, I think his name might be. Oh, it might be Willem because he's Dutch. I also used A Lycanthropy Reader, Werewolves in Western Culture, which was edited by Charlotte F. Otten. The Making of a Teen Wolf, Pierre de Longcay's confrontation with John Grenier by Jan Macilson. There's going to be a lot of French names and words popping up today, and I'm going to do awfully with all of them. I also used a brief section from Adam Douglas's The Beast Within, A History of the Werewolf, and I do mean very brief. And then I also used documents from the late Elmar Lore's website, which is elmar-lore.de, particularly his list of werewolf trial accuseds, and his article, How the Werewolf Came Among the Witches. And also a whole bunch of different ancient Greek, Roman, and early modern authors that we'll go into when relevant.
As for my sources, I got to go into a whole host of primary sources for the medieval period for this. So I have a short list of Norse sagas which I'll be referring to, including the Volsung saga, Hrolfr Kraki's saga, the Vansdala saga, the Ynglinga saga, Grettis saga, and a poem, wish me luck on this pronunciation, Harald Scathi, by Thorbjorn Hornclothy. Also went back into some of the Irish sources as well for this one. Cor Amnon, or Fitness of Names, an Irish genealogy. The Conquest of Ireland, which is part 2 of the Topographica Hibernica by Gerald of Wales. So not an Irish source, a source on Ireland in that case, I should say. And Acalum na Senera, a Middle Irish text of the Fianna cycle. Still on primary sources, going elsewhere in Europe, Ecclesiastical Ordinances by Canute the Great, Melion, a French romance, author unknown, Otia Imperialis by Gervase of Tilbury, and the Malleus Maleficarum by Heinrich Kramer. As well as that, a few books which helped me pull things together. The Werewolf in Law and Legend by Montague Summers. That was mainly used for the quotes that he gave from primary sources where the primary source is unavailable, which includes a Norse chronicle, the Kongskugja, Decretum by Burchard of Worms, and The Men Who Changed Themselves into Wolves by Nennius of Bangor. As well as that, The Book of Werewolves, being an account of a terrible superstition by the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, and Witches, Werewolves and Fairies, Shapeshifters and Astral Doubles in the Middle Ages by Claude Lecoteau.
Okay, so before we get into the kind of more historical and kind of pseudo-historical reconstructive attempts to trace the origins of werewolves, I want to briefly say a few words on the subject of shape changes in general and their potential origins, because werewolves are kind of inevitably wrapped up in that wider category of the shapeshifter, which we could do like a full episode on. You could probably do a full series on, to be honest. So to the best of my understanding, as someone who has run a mythology show for 5 years now and has also made a few other videos in that time on his channel that touched on aspects of mythology, I don't think there is a culture in the world that I've encountered that doesn't include some sort of shapeshifter in their mythology and folklore. It seems to be a relatively universal archetype. Whether it be a god taking the form of an animal to interact with the mortal world, or a mortal figure either willingly or forcefully being turned into one, the idea of humans shape-shifting into other creatures seems to be a relatively fundamental fascination of humanity. This fascination is apparent going back even as far as the Paleolithic and looking at some of the world's earliest artwork. The example I'm going to point to here is there are a small number of composite animal and human figures that are known to have appeared in Paleolithic cave art throughout Europe. There are many other examples of such hybrid figures also appearing in other types of rock art and cave art throughout the world. I'm highlighting this one because it's perhaps the earliest. These include figures such as the sorcerer of Le Troy Frere, which is depicted as a humanoid figure with stag-like features, the horned saucer of Gabalo, the bird-headed man of Lascaux, and a bison-headed figure that's been found at Chauvet Cave. These have generally been argued by most cave art scholars to represent either shamanic figures or sorcerers of some type who are depicted either symbolically turning into animals or perhaps as humans who are simply wearing animal skins during the course of some ritual behavior. I'm not going to go much further into this topic today because it kind of opens up a whole bag of worms with the wider subcategories of shape changers and all sorts of other theories that are out there. But if you want to know more about these specific figures, maybe go check out the video I made a few months ago for the Hiscrack YouTube channel titled, I think it's called Cave Art is Cool. If you want a general read on the subject, I'd also highly recommend the book Images of the Ice Age by Paul Barn and probably Cave Art by John Clott. Unfortunately, none of those figures that I mentioned before within European cave art display any wolf-like or canine traits. In fact, from what I know of, there's only one claimed image of a wolf, or possibly an early dog, to be found in all of cave art, and that is an engraving from Altamira Cave that was documented by Henri Breuer. I believe there may be more depictions of wolves in actual carved depictions of the time, but I haven't double-checked that, so that may be wrong. However, the existence of these early composite figures to me symbolizes that this type of shape-shifting figure is something of a basic idea within human mythology, and that whilst there is no evidence of any werewolf-like figure existing this far back, the idea of a metaphysical blurring of the boundary between us and animals has probably been present since long before we have any sort of recorded or reconstructed history involving it. In terms of the first claimed evidence for werewolves themselves, or at least figures that have inspired the later traditions of werewolves, we have to jump forward not quite to history, but to the world of reconstructed language. So, Cassie, do you want to explain what exactly I mean by that?
Yes, this is probably the most difficult section to really pin anything down, because it relies on reconstructing ideas in Proto-Indo European societies, so the society that is believed to have predated a lot of the earliest written history we have, so the Greeks, the Indian societies, Mesopotamia, etc.
Yeah, parts of Iran, India, yeah.
Yeah, so most of the Middle East, South Asia, and Europe, essentially. It relies on using later ideas and from these scattered cultures and trying to rebuild what may have been a precursor to it.
So this would have been potentially mythology or beliefs held by the Proto-Indo Europeans, which generally, as far as I'm aware, in terms of archaeologically at the moment, they're kind of identified with a group of steppe peoples in kind of areas like southern Ukraine, sort of area around there, around 4000 BCE, I think, sort of 4th millennium BCE, definitely.
Yeah, so
they're thought to have migrated throughout Europe and differentiated into the various other languages.
Yeah, so the precursor, I guess, the Scythians that the Greeks talk about from that sort of region.
Be one of the many cultures that they appear to have influenced.
Yeah, this part is something that I am far from experienced on, and so it's going to be quite brief. Two reasons that it's a bit of a tenuous link, I guess, to werewolves here. One, as we've said, this is a reconstructed mythology, and so there's no guarantee of it as accuracy. I was saying in the Q&A, actually, that these kind of reconstructed mythologies might sometimes be more of a reflection of the people reconstructing than the original mythology. But again, that's from my inexpert position here. The other reason is the wolfmen that these have been reconstructed from Proto-Indo European stuff is they're not shapeshifters at all. There's the suggestion of a religious cult or a belief involving a spiritual connection to wolves in the people that I'm about to describe, but physically they were completely human, from what I can understand. The connection to shapeshifting is just that they've been suggested to have worn wolf skins rather than magically shapeshifting in any way. So these theoretical wolfmen have been given the name of Koryos in the language that has been reconstructed for the Proto-Indo European people. As we say, this language is theorized to have been the precursor of languages including those of India and South Asia, Iran, Russia, the Slavic languages, Greek, Celtic, and Germanic languages altogether. The concept of Koryos was developed by anthropologists in Germany and Austria in the 1920s and 1930s, and given the German name at the time of Mannabund, meaning alliance of men. I was disappointed but not surprised to learn that this idea of a warrior cult associated with wolves did develop from far-right ideological beliefs originally in that particular time period. That is really what I'm saying about what I was saying about reflecting more on the reconstructors than the culture that they're trying to reconstruct. In the later 20th century, though, the idea of this as a true historical group was further developed based on later known warrior bands, such as certain types of Norse warriors, for example, that I'll be talking about later on. So in the 1980s, the scholar Kim McCone focused on later cultures descended from Indo-European cultures, which had the concept of late adolescent men who were as yet without land or property of their own, and so not fully integrated into the community, being sent to live in the wilds as bands of raiders, exempt from the normal laws and societal norms from their home, so long as their actions, their predations, as it were, did not target their own tribe. They would own nothing except for the weapons that they carried, any plunder they acquired, and any meat that they hunted, apart from what was needed to sustain them, was in theory returned to the tribe. In times of war, or when called back to defend their home, they're thought to have served as shock troops because they were renowned for extreme battle fury. We will later on be seeing a similar group with more historical evidence behind it being connected to wolves as well as other predatory animals. So, how do these warriors get associated with werewolves? The simple answer: they wear wolf pelts. They may also have taken wolf-related names while part of the Koryos. They're believed to have lived a predatory lifestyle, which the scholars describe as being wolf-like. Later European and Asian societies have, of course, given a lot of significance to the wolf as a totem, and even today, we tend to associate certain personality traits, sometimes incorrectly, with the wolf. J.P. Mallory,
the Alpha and the Omega and all this, which is actually based on captive wolves rather than real wolf packs,
Yeah, so again, says more about us than wolves. J.P. Mallory, who we referenced last time, also suggests a spiritual association with death and with the liminal space between society and the wild that wolves and dogs, as creatures that have become domesticated over time, do often occupy in later spiritual beliefs.
I'm not really going to go into this too much, but it has been argued by a number of scholars that like the Greeks and Romans considered dogs to be associated with like wolves and dogs to be associated with death and being outsider figures from society.
Yeah, and again, that's something that does show up even in more recent folklore, like the idea of the black dog, things like that. It is something that has really survived across the centuries and millennia, actually. And the werewolf, as we know it today, does in many ways share that particular trait, a creature that exists in the space between the civilized human world and the world of beasts. it's an interesting parallel between the physical transformation of the werewolf as we see it today and the psychological and social transformations that these scholars have described in the Choreos as transforming from a member of society to a creature of the wilds and being able to then transform back once they have come of age and are able to marry and have property. It does, to me, sometimes read as a retrospective comparison rather than evidence of an origin to werewolf beliefs, as some sources do try and attest.
It's kind of assuming that there's been a consistent through thread going back through time or automatically when we may not actually have that evidence. Exactly.
And that is the difficulty with these reconstructed mythologies. That's why it's interesting to find the patterns, but I'm still quite skeptical without the evidence of the connections that we make.
Very skeptical of these sort of things. Like, well, you said in the Q&A that we did before this that I always find myself with things like this in an uncomfortable position of like, I don't want to make what I call the expert problem or the ignorance problem, where I hear the methods by which this sort of thing is concluded with, and I think this sounds fundamentally unscientific and, as you say, perhaps based more on wishful thinking. I am aware, though, that I've had this with actual science, like as someone who worked in science for over a decade, I've had this with actual scientific disciplines when I first encountered them, and then realized over time, I just don't actually understand the jargon and the actual chemical or biological processes involved here. That's why I didn't think it made sense at first. So I'm always reticent whenever I come across this sort of thing to go, it all just sounds like nonsense to me for that reason, because I just don't have the expertise in language that these folks do. My general stance that I try to compromise with is it's interesting, but I'm not going to put any weight on it until you have something to back it up archaeologically or in terms of documents.
Yeah, that's roughly where I stand as well.
Yeah.
So it's good to be able to investigate these patterns and look at how the cultures may have evolved, but being able to then build from that. This is a culture, the Choreos were a people that existed.
Yeah.
I think that's still something that does need.
We can't even do that for many other cultures around the world with a lot of their major groups, where we're like, we've got a name, we've got nothing else but the name of this thing. We don't know what it is.
Yeah. And to sort of build on what we have just said, the idea does receive criticism actually in more scholarly circles as well. There are more expert people who are giving similar criticisms to what we've been saying as to whether the idea could truly have existed as a unified concept in Proto-Indo European societies. It does make some sense as the origin for stories in which a warrior is given a canine name and known for his berserk fury, such as the hero of our previous episode, Cuchulainn. And it makes sense that such a group may have existed in a society or in their stories, but connecting them to werewolves as we know them and describing it as where the concept originated does feel a bit too much of a stretch for me. We do have a few later stories of wolfmen or dogmen in the ancient world. The main one that's really relevant today is a group from Vedic culture in ancient India, where the Rig Veda, one of their oldest holy texts, mentions warriors similar to the Choreos. These are described in the same manner as the various scholars have described the Choreos, as young men sent to live out in the wild, landless and with no possessions or no rights within their society, but also exempt from laws and taboos, and taking on dog or wolf names. So this has a lot of the influences that then went back into this Proto-Indo European thing.
That does seem a bit more. I feel like there's more to that if we do actually have documents that are actually outlining this group. Like, I also can see parallels to later groups, like in Latium, in the region around Rome, before Rome kind of became the major power in the area. It was not an uncommon thing, I believe, in Latin city-states to send out bands of young men to raid nearby cities. And it was kind of like this endless web of vendettas and arguments between cities as a result that eventually got resolved by Rome taking over the region. But yes, no, it's interesting. There is actually a little bit of something there, possibly.
So we do have societies that have these types of warriors, and the skepticism more comes from back tracing those into one single origin culture, as opposed to these being things that evolved separately.
Yeah, because the Indo-Europeans went on a bit of a winding route before they became, I think it's the Indo-Aryans, they're called, the people who moved into northwestern India, is what they're currently believed. So it could potentially develop along the way, something like that. I might be jumping the gun here on something you've got to say. I'm not quite sure how that idea links up with later ideas of werewolves that we're going to be talking about in later periods. I don't see any direct influence.
Yeah, that's it. Even as I talk a bit more about the Vedic culture, again, it's something that I personally don't see how it links to werewolves. Some of the sources I've read do try and link it to werewolves, but it is the earliest we have of wolf men, even if they weren't physically transforming in any way. And there is a connection based on similarities to some Norse figures, more than likely evolved independently.
Yeah.
But I do make a sort of similar connection with taking on wolf-like behaviours with certain Norse figures, as we'll see in a bit. So these particular warriors from the Vedic culture, they were allegedly initiated into a warrior band at the winter solstice, the year they turned 16, described as undergoing a ritual death before being reborn as dogs of war. They lived in the wild for 4 years as raiders, and at the end of this period, a final sacrifice at the summer solstice was performed to ritually transform them from these dog warriors into adult men, and returning as full members of society. These rituals were performed by the Vratyas, or dog priests, and connected to the retinue of the war god Indra. This retinue of heavenly creatures were similarly wild men creatures named Maruts. So this is quite clearly one of the documented beliefs that contributed to the reconstruction of the idea of the Koryos in Proto-Indo European society. But again, the connection to the dog or the wolf is largely symbolic rather than any physical transformation.
Yeah.
Their predatory behavior still exists in the context of warfare rather than feeding on human flesh or terrorizing random villages.
I do think, though, like sending out a group of guys, having a group of guys suddenly show up with weapons and wolf skins on them, I'd be pretty like, oh no, I'm in real trouble.
So would I. That's it. The way that I can think that it would be seen as a connection and predating the werewolf is, like you just gave us, from the perspective of the victims. Survivors of the raids would be quite traumatized, as you've just described, and as I would also imagine. And as with many monster sightings we've discussed over the years, in the minds of someone who is quite understandably terrified, seeing a supernatural wolf man instead of a mundane warrior wearing a wolf pelt is a quite easy thing for the wolf brain. Is a quite easy thing for the human brain to do. I'm blurring the boundaries between human brain, and wolf here.
That part. I think I'm thinking of the reptile brain, but within you there are two wolf brains.
And in the words of Miles O'Brien, sorry about the transporter malfunction. Inside you, there are two wolves. Inside Mozart, there were like 10 or 11. That's why they called him Wolfgang.
Anyone who has ADHD out there, you just have too many wolves. I'm sorry.
Yeah. You have a Wolfgang. I've got completely lost now. Yeah. My notes here do remind me that, yes, I'm aware that all of that does slightly contradict what I said about the link being too tenuous.
Yeah.
The idea of, yes, it makes sense from the perspective of the victims, but none of the scholars who were referenced in the books that I've read, none of them mentioned these groups. None of them who mentioned these groups put forward that explanation for why the warriors were connected to werewolves. As I was writing the section, I was only reading things that described them from the perspective of the societies that the wolf warriors came from. And I only shifted perspective right as I got to the end of the section and realized maybe that's the connection. It would be entirely speculation at this stage. There's more speculation that makes a bit more sense later on with another band of warriors. It relies on the Koryos being real, the wolf connection that's been theorized being accurate, and relies on later Indo-European societies incorporating enough survivors from raids by the Koreos or by the Vedic warrior bands for these kind of stories to have survived over millennia
to become a
precursor
motif.
to werewolves. So even then, it is a connection that I'm afraid can't be proven. So with that, we're going to leave the Proto-Indo-European world behind and move forward to a time where we have a bit more documentary evidence. So I'll hand over to you, Charles, to take us on a trip to the Greco-Roman world.
Okay, thank you, Cassie. Moving on beyond some very early documents and philological reconstructions, the actual earliest point at which we can identify what have been claimed as werewolves in the historical record really is going to come down to your interpretation of what you mean by werewolf, I think. If you mean any type of transformation of a human into a wolf, then you can potentially trace this back as far as the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the book The Beast Within, Adam Douglas argues that this would place the earliest written version of the werewolf myth back around 2750 BCE, which, as someone who actually knows their Epic of Gilgamesh perhaps too well, I would heavily dispute. See the 2.5-hour video I made about the development of the Gilgamesh myth. The passage that Adam Douglas is actually referring to only appears in the much later standard Babylonian version of the epic, which dates from around the late 2nd millennium BCE. It does not appear in either the fragmentary Old Babylonian version of the epic, nor the potentially even older Sumerian Gilgamesh poems. In the relevant section, the goddess Ishtar attempts to seduce Gilgamesh, who rebuffs her, citing her mistreatment of her former lovers. One of these lovers was a shepherd, and to quote Stephanie Daly's translation of the text, "You loved the shepherd, herdsman, and chief shepherd, who was always heaping up the glowing ashes for you and cooked ewe lambs for you every day. But you hit him and turned him into a wolf. His own herd boys hunted him down, and his dogs tear at his haunches." That is interesting there. Like, it's one of the earliest examples I know of a folkloric, like, ironic punishment like that, where you get turned into the very thing that you used to help hunt down.
The Greeks were also fans of that kind of ironic punishment.
They really were, yeah. If you want to say that this transformation constitutes the first werewolf, this would push the known record back to the end of the 2nd millennium BCE. If you want to argue, however, that the earliest werewolf story requires the bearer to be the victim of a curse brought about by their own actions, usually their own impiety or insult to a god of some type, or it must be a figure that is capable of transforming back and forth between a man or a wolf, or that they have to transform into a wolf that retains some humanoid attributes, you have to look to the later time periods of ancient Greece and Rome. Regardless of which criteria you favour, these are also the earliest cultures that have a significant body of written accounts where people are transformed into wolves. So, as noted by Richard Buxton, we know that at the time of the earliest historic documents and laws in ancient Greece, the wolf was considered to be a cruel predator, one that posed a major threat to domesticated animals in parts of the region that relied more on pasturage than agrarianism. As such, the killing of wolves was considered a noble and fairly brave pursuit, which perhaps would earn you a reward. As an example, in one of the early laws of, is it Solon? S-O-L-O-N.
Not sure on that one.
No, I'm not sure either. In the 6th century BCE, in 6th century BC Athens, this law decreed that a man who brought in a wolf was to be paid 5 drachmas, whilst any who brought in a wolf cub was to be paid 1 drachma. I did a bit of a look into this, and apparently 1 drachma was the daily wage of a skilled labourer prior to the Peloponnesian War. So that's not a sum to be sniffed at. That's like 5 days, like, wage for a skilled labourer.
You're saying that's what a Greek urn is?
Cut it down, it's over.
I am so sorry.
Allusions to the wolf were also occasionally used in Greek mythology and literature to demonstrate either cruelty or great ferocity as a warrior. Richard Buxton again cites as examples of this how in the Iliad, Achilles' Myrmidons, or is it Myrmidians? I can't remember. Myrmidons, sorry, are likened to wolves as they prepare to battle. To quote from Robert Fagel's excellent translation, they're described as being hungry as wolves that rend and bolt raw flesh, hearts filled with battle frenzy that never dies. Off on the cliffs, ripping apart some big antlered stag, they gorge on the kill till all their jaws drip red with blood. Then down in a pack they lope to a pooling dark spring, their lean sharp tongues lapping the water's surface, belching bloody meat, but the fury never shaken. Builds inside their chest though their glutted bellies burst, so wild the myrmidon captains.
That's some visceral description.
It's really, really good.
I love that.
I'm quite glad that I made the reference in the Q&A to the Iliad being one of the most elegant texts of the ancient world, then got to read that out immediately afterwards in this recording.
Wonderful.
According to Mika Rissanen, there is also some evidence that wolves did have some religious significance, as they were occasionally offered up as sacrifices to the gods in ancient Greece. The late 5th and early 4th century BC military leader and writer Xenophon notes in his work The Anabasis that Greek soldiers would seal an oath by sacrificing a bull, a wolf, a boar, and a ram over a shield. According to Pausanias, wolves and wolf cubs were also sacrificed alongside bears, wild boars, deers, and gazelles at the Lapria festival, which was held each year in the town of Patras to commemorate the goddess Artemis. Pausanias is mostly known, I think he's a 2nd century AD writer.
Yeah.
Or CE, or whatever version you want to use.
Yeah, Roman travel writer.
Yeah, he was Greek, but he wrote in Roman times.
Yeah.
And he did like a big travel log of Greece, which includes many different like folkloric and religious ideas about different locations.
Yeah, I've referenced his descriptions of Greece in, I think, all 3 of our Greek episodes, I think.
I'll be doing that again quite significantly here.
Nice.
Whilst these sacrifices may indicate some special significance for this animal, I want to note that in both of those cases that I described, these wolves were being sacrificed alongside other fearsome creatures, so it may have been a case of wolves being selected as one of many animals that were just considered ferocious rather than them being considered special in and of themselves. In Rome, this picture appears to have been somewhat more complicated. According again to Mika Rissanen's Was There a Taboo on Killing Wolves in Rome? The wolf certainly seems to have played an important symbolic role in Roman mythology and religion. The most famous example is in all the various versions of the Roman foundation myth, where the abandoned twins Romulus and Remus are suckled by a she-wolf prior to being found and adopted by Faustulus. There are, however, also a small number of dedications to the wolf that are known of, such as the figure of the Lupa Romana and the Lupa Augusta, which have been found in Spain. I think the Lupa Romana is also, I think, a reference to the actual statues you sometimes see of like a wolf with like infants being suckled. Although I'm pretty certain that that's actually a false combination of images where you'll see one, I think, on the Capitoline Hill that's quite often displayed, but I think the actual wolf figure is much older than the actual children they're suckling, so it appears to have been something that archaeologists might have thrown together, or maybe the Romans threw together later.
I'll check if I have a picture of that from when I was there.
There are also recorded instances in Roman annals of wolves occasionally entering the city of Rome itself, which was generally considered an ill omen. Usually these wolves, when they entered the city, were not killed. They were instead driven away, although I don't know if that was like a specific prescription that was being upheld there against killing them. According to Pliny the Elder, the body of the wolf was also thought to have many magical and medical uses. However, the wolf... that'll be from Pliny's Natural History, I assume. However, the wolf would have remained a major threat during these times to domesticated sheep and goats, so it would only have been natural for it still to have been hunted during this period, even if there was some religious significance to the creature. Despite this, according to Rissanen, there are actually very few references to organised wolf hunts or even attempts to exterminate them. There was also apparently little demand for their meat, because as far as I'm aware, it tastes bad. I've never had it, but I'm told wolf does not taste good. And the only known demand for wolf pelts could possibly have been as part of the battle gear for Roman velites, as described in the works of Polybius. So my conclusion from what I've read is that wolves were probably considered in a similar light by the Romans as they were by the Greeks, with maybe a few important symbolic differences due to the wolf's role in their foundation myth. So wolves clearly were considered important animals by both societies, though. And unsurprisingly, there are multiple accounts from both Greek and later Roman authors, both in mythology and wider literature, that feature wolves, and there are even a few that involve people being shapeshifted into wolves. So for the rest of this section, I'm going to go through and outline some of the more important examples. To me, most of these tales fall into the wider Greek and Roman traditions of gods or godlike beings transforming humans into other creatures, either as a punishment or in some cases to try and protect them against the acts of other humans and deities. So this is kind of me, I think, possibly the earliest thread of werewolves, or at least being turned into a wolf, being as a result of a specific curse for your actions. Personally, from reading through these accounts, I don't see how these are enough. I don't think these are enough to establish that there was a single widely recognized folkloric figure of the werewolf that was venerated during this time, as some of the authors I consulted have gone so far as to claim. They're simply too sparse and often separated by quite large distances, both in terms of time and geographical space, to be an actual single coherent tradition as far as I'm concerned. The authors of these tales also generally just describe people as being transformed into literal wolves or lycos, rather than the more familiar hybrid man or wolf figure that we know in modern times. I think that's actually going to be a thread we'll see comes in way, way later. There is
I
one...
don't see the hybrid at all.
Oh, okay.
So, sorry.
That may be something for part 2 then.
Yeah.
There is one possible exception to this that I'll get into later, so maybe just keep that in the back of your minds. Now, despite there being few physical details about these transformed wolves that fully evoke the modern idea of the werewolf, a few of these tales do contain some elements that came to be associated with werewolves in later folklore and literature. For example, whilst at no point in these stories is there any evidence that transformation into a wolf was linked to the moon in any way, in a few of these tales and rituals, these transformations do take place at night. In some tales, they are also seen either to retain their human minds or occasionally to have ways of returning to their human forms. Before I go into those tales, I do want to note that we sometimes see the term versipellis being used to describe these creatures, which can mean a skin changer or potentially a shapeshifter, which is a term that's not specifically limited to wolves in accounts of the time. There is something that I'd say is close to a sleight of hand that I've seen in my research for this episode, where some authors will, when providing their own translations of relevant classical sources, just take the term versipellis and uncritically just write in werewolf instead. This puts me a little bit to mind of how, when we're talking about some of the Native American traditions that have been compared to Bigfoot, where a lot of Bigfoot advocates will just write Bigfoot rather than like the hairy man or whatever the appropriate term it actually translates to is. I don't think this is quite as bad as that example. I think this is probably half justified as swap outs go. As this term versipellis, there's some evidence that it is closely linked with the idea of transforming into wolves. There's also some which kind of disputes that, though. The main one is that there is a quote from Pliny the Elder in Book 8 of his Natural History that does heavily connect the term with wolves. And that quote is, "The men have been turned into wolves and again restored to their original form, we must confidently look upon as untrue, unless, indeed, we are ready to believe all the tales which for so many ages have been found to be fabulous. But as the belief of it has become so firmly fixed in the minds of the common people, as to have caused the term versipellis, meaning skin changer, to be used as the common form of imprecation, I will here point to its origin." He then points to an example that we're going to discuss in a moment, specifically the claims that the men of Arcadia have a tradition of transforming into wolves as part of a rite. He does, however, pronounce that this claimed origin point is a falsehood, writing that, quote, "It is really wonderful to what a length the credulity of the Greeks will go. There is no falsehood, if ever so barefaced, to which some of them cannot be found to bear testimony." Conversely, though, in Apuleius's comic novel, which is the actual name, I believe, is The Metamorphoses, not to be confused with that of Ovid. I might have this mixed up with another text. It might also be known by the term the Golden Ass.
I've heard of the Golden Ass.
Yeah. In this comic novel, he describes a versipellis as being capable of turning into any creature at all with no specific mention of wolves. The exact quote is, "These horrible creatures can change their skins and creep in secretly with their looks transformed into any sort of animal at all." But that is a comic novel, so my natural inclination would be to trust Pliny a little bit more, but Pliny's not that reliable either. He tends to give some pretty wild stuff in his books. What we can conclude from from Pliny's earlier quote, though, is that most people at the time thought that people became skin changers due to a curse. Whether this was understood to be a general explanation behind the existence of all such creatures is something that I wasn't really able to determine. Neither was the main author that I used as a source for this, I think was Daniel Ogden. But there are also a few other sources that do tend to back up that idea. For example, there is an episode in one of Aesop's fables where a man pretends to be a skin changer and says, quote, "Now, my good man, I do not know for what reason the urge to yawn comes upon me, be it my errors, or for some other reason unknown to me. But whenever I yawn 3 times, I become a man-eating wolf." Is that inconvenient? Very convenient if you want to scare an innkeeper, though, as he's trying to do in this story. So Daniel Ogden argues that the specific word used in this quote for errors, which is hamartius, indicates that this involved some sort of offense against the gods. However, he also notes the earliest version of this particular fable is most known from a later Byzantine compilation, claiming to be of Aesop's work, so it's uncertain whether its language encapsulates an authentic belief from the time. Outside of these examples, we will see, though, that there is ample evidence throughout ancient Greek literature and mythology that skin changes often originated from a curse inflicted upon them by the gods, sometimes as a punishment directly for their misdeeds. And unfortunately, there's also a lot of collateral damage on occasion of people around them.
God's punishments tend to do that.
Yes, in one incredible fashion that we're going to see later on involving our boy Zeus. In terms of actual ancient Greek and Roman stories of people being transformed into wolves, there is one story that stands out from all the others as being by far the most widely discussed by ancient authors. This is the myth of, and I swear to God if I got this wrong, the myth of Lycaon?
That sounds good enough to me.
Yeah, Lychaon. Lycaon.
Yeah.
And his associated festival of the Lycaea, which took place on Mount Lycaon, which literally means Wolf Mountain, or at least the Greeks thought it meant that. There's some debate over the exact etymology of the term Lycos, which means wolf, and Lycaeos, which refers to a region in Arcadia, I believe. So in Greek myth, Lycaon was the king of the Arcadians, who was transformed into a wolf for angering Zeus. The best recounting of this myth I could find is in Pseudo-Apollodorus's Bibliotheca or Teca. I want to say Biblioteca just because it's the Spanish version that I was taught as a kid.
Same.
Which we've talked about a bunch in the past on this podcast, and it's just basically the best document if you want a quick overview of Greek mythology. In this account, King Lycaon is a descendant of Zeus, who along with his 50 sons is known throughout Greece for his arrogance and impiety. One day, Zeus decides to test them for their impiety and pays a visit to their home in the guise of a simple labourer. Lycaon and his sons receive him and invite him to share their hospitality. Lycaon's oldest son, Menelaus, then instigates his brother to slaughter a local child, which they mix with the entrails from animal sacrifices and serve Zeus. Zeus is rightly disgusted by this, and he responds by overturning the table and striking Lycaon and all of his sons except for the youngest of them with thunderbolts. I believe that there is a goddess who intervenes to save the youngest son, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Where the wolf part of this tale comes in is in variants of this account given by other authors. The first version I have comes from Pausanias, who in his description of Greece wrote that Lycaon was the founder of the city of Lycosura on Mount Lycaeus, that he founded the Lycaean Games, and they also attached the name Lycaeus to that of Zeus. As Lycaon can effectively be understood to mean the wolf by some readings, to a modern ear you could describe this chain of events as King Wolf founding Wolf City on Wolf Mountain to found the Wolf Games in order to win the favour of Wolf Zeus.
Wolves all the way down.
Yes. Pausanias describes Lycaon as being far more ignorant of religious matters than his claimed contemporary King Creutz, Curetes, Creutz of Athens, who would mark sacrifices to Zeus by burning a type of cake known as a pelanoi, which would be made from the first fruits of the harvest. Instead, Lycaon marked his sacrifice to Lycaean Zeus by killing a baby and pouring its blood over the altar. So some fairly significant theological divergence between those two positions.
There is a big difference between fruitcake and the baby.
Yeah, maybe somewhere in between, I would suggest. Maybe a fruitcake shaped like a baby. For doing this, he was immediately transformed into a wolf by Zeus.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So to again paraphrase a line from a friend of the podcast and General Blue Sky Menace Mel, who actually stole this line from originally. Probably know her best from Blue Sky and a lot of posting. Oh God, a lot of posting. Unbelievably, King Wolf, who founded Wolf City on Wolf Mountain to found the Wolf Games in order to win the favor of Wolf Zeus, ended up being turned into a wolf. Oh yeah, I have a little note here about the etymology of Lykios versus Lycaeos. Modern etymologists kind of dispute, as I said before, the idea that there's any connection between those two words. According to Richard Gordon's excellent article, Good to Think, Wolves and Wolfmen in the Greco-Roman World, which is in the book Werewolf Histories, this is not something that the ancient Greeks themselves would have agreed on. But there is also like a trend of like pseudo-etymologies in a lot of ancient cultures where they kind of tie things together because they sound similar. The ancient Greeks thought that they were very much connected. Hey folks, it's Charles here. Just to correct something I said here, I got the word slightly wrong. So the word Lycos actually means wolf, not Lykios. And the word Lykios refers to a Lycian or someone who is born in Lycia, rather than being an exact name for a region. Everything else I said, though, is still broadly accurate. There are also several other alternative versions of this account. The most well-known is the variant contained in the Roman author Ovid's Metamorphoses, which resembles that of Pseudo-Apollodorus's, basically with the wolf details added in. Here, Zeus, or I believe it's Jove or Jupiter, he's named, depending on the translation, reveals himself as a god whilst visiting Lycaon, but the impious king scoffs at the idea and ridicules those who worship him. To test the idea, he originally tries to kill him in his sleep, and upon failing, he kills a Molossian hostage, I think that's another area within Greece, and cooks him up to serve to Zeus. And I shall take up Ovid's tale here. Quote, "And when this flesh was served to me on tables, I destroyed his dwelling and his worthless household gods." These words are in the mouth of Jove. "With thunderbolts avenging. Terror-struck, he took to flight, and on the silent plains is howling in his vain attempts to speak. He raves and rages, and his greedy jaws, desiring their accustomed slaughter, turn against the sheep, still eager for their blood. His vesture separates in shaggy hair, his arms are changed to legs, and as a wolf, he has the same grey locks, the same hard face, the same bright eyes, the same ferocious look." In this version, Lycaon's actions are also the final straw for Zeus's condemnation of the men of bronze, and results in him sending the great deluge that we discussed in our episode on Pandora's Box. Other variants on this tale are also presented by authors such as Hyginus, Lycophron, and Aristophanes. Don't know why I have strung on that one.
The playwright.
Yeah. To summarize a few of their unique elements, in Hyginus's Fabulae, all of Lycaon's sons are also cursed to become wolves like him. Whereas in his other work, the Astronomica, the butchered victim is Arcas, the son of Zeus, or Jupiter in this case, and also of one of Lycaon's daughters, Callisto. So this would give even more of justification for Zeus's actions. In a surviving epitome of Aristophanes' Katasterismi, Arcas is then put back together by Zeus, and after a chain of events which includes his mother being turned into a bear and almost accidentally killed by him, he and her are both eventually placed in the stars where they shine to this day. In Lycophron's account, the man killed is instead his son Nyctimus, which means night, or at least is connected to night. I've seen some authors try and use this to argue that the actual, I think Richard Buxton does this, that this is an earliest connection between werewolves and night.
That's a bit of a leap.
It is a bit of a leap, I think. There are a couple of other stories that say that they do take place at night, though, but, you know. According to Daniel Ogden, there is also a fragment of Hesiod's Catalogue of Women that makes a brief reference to Lycaon's transgression, which would make it the oldest source for the idea that this myth was kicking around. For the life of me, though, I could not find an independent translation of it anywhere outside of it being briefly mentioned in his book. As for the festival that the myth that I just talked about inspired, the Lycaea supposedly involved a ritual that was rumoured to involve shapeshifting, and according to some sources, cannibalism. In his description of Greece, Pausanias claims that ever since the time of King Lycaon, a sacrifice has been performed at Mount Lycaon to Lycaean Zeus, might be Lycaean, and that it is said that a man is changed into a wolf. However, this change is not for life, as if the man is able to abstain from eating human flesh whilst in wolf form for 9 years, he will be restored to his original body. So that's the first element we have, the idea that someone could potentially be trans back and forth from a man to a wolf to a man again. Pausanias also includes details of the site of the altar for this ritual, which he claims to be a large earthen mound on the highest point of the mountain. Tragically for us, Pausanias then states that he did not inquire as to what the exact details of this rite involved, and that he, quote, let them be as they are and were from the beginning. So what he's basically just done there is rolled up and said, yo, check out this sick wolf, sick cannibal wolf thing that's going on over there. I'm not going to tell you about it.
Some great travel writing there.
Yeah.
Really makes you want to go visit.
It's one of those things, though, where it might be a case of it was so well known because there's loads of different versions of describing this. The rites may have just been so well known that no one thought to write them down.
Up there with the old dictionary that defined horses. Everyone knows what a horse is.
Yes. Who's the guy who liked to troll Aristotle, who Alexander the Great spoke to?
Diogenes.
Yeah, Diogenes.
Behold a man.
Yeah, behold a man. A man is like a non-feathered biped, so he showed up with a chicken he'd plucked, or something like
behold
that. Behold a man. Pausanias also makes a very brief skeptical reference to this festival elsewhere that broadly matches this description, writing that, quote, as to the boxer by name Demarchus, an Arcadian of Parrhasia, I cannot believe, Farhasia probably is, I cannot believe, except of course his Olympic victory, what romancers say about him, how he changed his shape into that of a wolf at the sacrifice of Lycaean Zeus, and how 9 years after he became a man again. So, a very brief aside in Book 8 of Plato's The Republic also largely confines this account, and adds in the element of cannibalism. Quote, it is not obviously when the Protector's acts begin to reproduce the legend that is told of the shrine of Lycaean Zeus in Arcadia. The story goes that he who tastes of the one bit of human entrails minced up with those of other victims is inevitably transformed into a wolf. Other sources for this legend also include Pliny's Natural History, Pliny the Elders, along with Polybius and Plato's dialogue Minos. All these largely cover the exact same material, so I've not gone into them here, but it was clearly a widely known tradition throughout Greece. So I think from this we can safely say that there was likely some form of transformation rite performed on Mount Lycaon in classical Greek times, even if the exact details have not survived. Whether or not they actually involve cannibalism as a result is uncertain. It's possible that this was the case, or for all we know, it may have been the product of speculation that naturally spread around due to the rites being potentially somewhat secretive in nature. One interesting interpretation of this ritual practice by Richard Buxton kind of plays into the idea of the wolf as the outsider or emblematic of the wilderness or separate from human society. He argues that it may have been some sort of initiation rite, where young men had to be separated from Arcadian society for a time in order to be considered adults. The problem with this idea, which he rightly notes, is that 9 years seems to be an awfully long time to spend in the wilderness, during which time society would have been deprived of these young men's prime period of their labour. An explanation he suggests is that this time may have been exaggerated for mythic reasons, and could in practice have been shorter, so you could potentially say maybe it was actually 9 days or something like that, but we've got no evidence either way.
That is another one that connects, I guess, back to the Choreos, if it's an initiation rite separating the young men from society for a time to live in the wild.
Could potentially.
So yeah, it's another one that could have been reconstructed from.
Interestingly, the supposed rite was also mentioned by a number of later Christian writers. These include the 4th century writer St. Augustine, who cites the early Roman author Marcus Terentius Varro, and the 7th century writer Isidore of Seville in his work The Etymologies. Both authors also mention it in connection with another account that we'll get into shortly. It's also apparently mentioned by the 12th century Byzantine author John, this is a nightmare, Tzetzes, spelled Tzetzes.
I'm not even going to try
Tzetzes, I think it might be. I did run out of time, though, to go and find and verify the actual quote for that one today. I was writing until like literally 10 minutes before the episode, I think, as we might have said before. I want to mention these quickly, though, as to me it does indicate that some knowledge of these traditions continued into the later medieval period. I'm interested to find out if there's any continuity with them to be discussed in your section, Cassie. I don't know if there really is. It might just be these scattered mentions.
I don't think I really connect, my stuff really connects to any of it at all. I start with Norse, so...
Yeah, fair enough. It may be a kind of a lost thread there.
Yeah, I think so.
The next tale I want to cover is perhaps the earliest ancient Greek story that has been claimed to resemble the werewolf, appearing as it does in Homer's The Odyssey. During the course of Book 10 of the Odyssey, after having many of their comrades slain by the Lycaonians, Odysseus and his crew arrive on the island of Aea? A-E-A-E-A. Aea.
Yeah, Aea.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the home of the wicked nymph Circe, who is said to be the daughter of the sea. After a few days, Odysseus sends out a band of men led by Eurylochus to scout the island's woods. Deep in this forest, they find Circe's palace, and I will now quote from the relevant passage, again taken from the same source I did for the Iliad, same translation. Deep in the wooded glens they came to Circe's palace. Built of dressed stone on a cleared rise of land, mountain wolves and lions were roaming round the grounds. She'd bewitched them herself, she gave them magic drugs. But they wouldn't attack my men, they just came pouring up around them, fawning, swishing their long tails, eager as hounds that fawn around their master, coming home from a feast, who always brings back scraps to calm them down. So they came nuzzling around my men, lions, wolves with big powerful claws, and the men cringed in fear. Again, Daniel Ogden kind of rewrites that a little bit to they came walking around my men, kind of, I think, to like link the idea that they maybe were walking on 2 feet. I don't know how reasonable he is because he provides his own translations for these. I don't know how reasonable that is as a translation. It does tie into something else, another thread of this story, though, that I'm going to get into in a minute. Circe goes on to trick the men into entering her halls with her song, where they partake of a feast. Circe then waves her wand, at which point they are all turned into pigs. Eurylochus saw through the trap, however, and stayed behind, and he flees and informs Odysseus. Later, after Odysseus has thwarted Circe's attempt to do the same to him, won her to his side, and freed his comrades from the spell, Eurylochus cautions them against returning to her halls with the following lines. So I said, and they jumped to do my bidding. Only Eurylochus tried to hold my shipmates back. His mutinous outbursts aimed at one and all. Poor fools, where are we running now? Why are we tempting fate? Why stumble blindly down to Circe's halls? She'll turn us all into pigs or wolves or lions, made to guard that palace of hers, by force I tell you, just as the Cyclops trapped our comrades in his lair, with hot-headed Odysseus right beside them all. Thanks to this man's rashness, they died too. So it's clear from this text that the wolves and lions that were mentioned in the previous excerpt were originally humans that were transformed by Circe. I think we can say that. Daniel Ogden makes what I think is also quite a compelling argument that the behavior of these creatures towards the humans could then be interpreted not as the affectionate pawing that they originally reported, but as a desperate plea for help from Odysseus's men. It doesn't explicitly say that, but I think that's a fun reading of it. Or potentially a horrifying reading of it. There's also a thing like before this where Odysseus kills a deer as part of a hunt, and you could also possibly take the reading that that deer was a transformed human as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is the sort of thing that Greek authors would have, I think.
Interestingly, there are also some depictions of the scene in Greek pottery dating from the 6th century BCE, and in them, the wolves and lions are often shown to have humanoid bodies and animal heads. As far as I'm aware, this could constitute the earliest depiction of the human-wolf hybrid figure that exists in world history. This same tale was also discussed by later authors in connection with the aforementioned Arcadian werewolfism, in quotes, including by the aforementioned Augustine and Isidore of Seville. Another famous story from this time that has been related to later werewolf tradition comes to us from section 61 of the comic novel The Satyricon by the 1st century CE author Petronius. In this section, a man named Trimalchio challenges Nicerus, who up until this point has remained silent at a feast, to tell a story of his adventures. Niceros is delighted to be asked to give his story, even though he expects that he will be laughed at for it. He proceeds to tell a story of when he was a slave and fell in love with the wife of the local innkeeper, Melissa of Tarentum. He makes a point that he fell in love with her for her beautiful nature and generosity, not just because she happened to also be absolutely stunning. One day her husband died, and Niceros vowed to claim her. Niceros, sorry. He persuaded a soldier guest to come with him whilst his master was away, and the two of them set off on the road before dawn. The moon was shining so strong it felt like high noon, and as they were passing some roadside tombs, the other man went off to read the epitaphs. Now, I've seen some variant translations where they stop because the other man actually needs a piss. I think the one where they go off to read the epitaphs might be a bit of a Victorian, let's make this more acceptable for the kiddies.
Gone to inspect the plumbing.
Yes.
Gone to read the epitaphs for a moment.
That's a euphemism I'm going to reuse. Niceros, I think it's Niceros, actually. Is it Niceros? Niceros.
I'm not sure, because it'll be Latin, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So it changes the rules a bit from Greek, so I can't say.
Probably Niceros. Niceros amused himself by counting the graves for a while, then went to find what had happened to his friend. When he found him, he discovered that he had stripped himself and put all his clothes by the roadside. The man then urinated in a ring around his clothes, and then to Niceros' shock, suddenly turned into a wolf, gave a great howl and ran off into the woods. In a blind terror, Niceros went to pick up his friend's clothes, only to find that they had turned to stone. He then fled all the way to Melissa's house, drawing his sword on the shadows as he went. When he arrived, Melissa was surprised at him being out so late, and told him that if he'd only arrived earlier, he might have helped them. Apparently, a wolf had got into their house and killed some of their sheep, before a slave managed to strike him in the neck with a spear. On his way back, Niceros found that the man's clothes had now vanished, replaced only by a pool of blood. When he arrived home, he found the man restored to human form, but in bed with an injury to his neck that was being tended by a doctor. It was then that Niceros realized that the man was a versipelus, or skin changer, and he refused to ever after break bread with him again. I hadn't realized this as I was writing the script, but this actually does make a point that the moon was like really prominent and large in the sky. I don't think it's supposed to be connected, but it's just a fun little coincidence.
Yeah.
Another famous tale of this period that has been linked to later werewolf traditions is the story of the hero of Temesa. There are several different versions of this tale that we know about, but the one that's most frequently cited is the version that is again to be found in Pausanias's description of Greece. Pausanias. I'm really bad with these names. I just keep saying different variants over and over again.
If you say enough variants, one of them will be right.
Just copy and paste that one over all the other ones. Just crop it in really artlessly. According to his text, during the course of the Odyssey, Odysseus landed in several cities in Italy and Sicily, and once put in at the Greek settlement of Temesa. According to a very basic Wikipedia search, the location of the city is now lost, but apparently it was near the city of Terina on the big toe of Sicily. Whilst they were staying in the city, one of Odysseus' men got drunk and raped a local woman, who Temesa's inhabitants then stoned to death. Odysseus cared nothing for this loss, and after he had sailed away, the ghost of the man continued to attack and kill the local people. The inhabitants of Temesa then resolved to flee Italy, but the Pythian priestess forbade them to leave. Instead, she convinced them to give the ghost his own sanctuary and temple to placate him, and to deliver to him as his wife each year the city's fairest maiden. This appeared to work, and for a time they did not suffer from his terrors. As the temple was being constructed, however, a famed boxer named Euphemus happened to arrive in town. This man was a multiple-time Olympic champion, and when he heard of the unusual way this ghost was being placated, he decided to go and see the temple himself. On arriving there, he felt a strong desire to go inside, and upon seeing the girl who had been promised for the ghost, he felt a great sense of pity towards her. The girl swore to marry him if he would save her from the ghost, and he put on his armour and waited for the ghost to assail him as it had the other townsfolk. When the fight came, he completely trounced the ghost, driving it out of the land, and it disappeared into the depths of the ocean. Where the werewolf aspect of the story comes in is in the succeeding paragraph, where Pausanias describes an image he saw that apparently was supposed to depict the expulsion of the ghost, which he claims was a copy of an ancient original. He describes the ghost as a creature, quote, horribly black in colour, exceedingly dreadful in appearance, and as having a wolf's skin thrown about him as a garment. And for the sake of completeness, Herodotus also makes a brief reference to similar practices of transformation among the Neuri, who were a group that most scholars now believe lived north of Scythia in areas of northwestern Ukraine and southern Belarus, which is kind of an unusual area to hear discussed by the Greeks. I wouldn't actually realize there was anything like talking about that area, although, as we'll see in a second, understanding of what was going on there seems to have been quite murky, to put it politely. Archaeologically, this group has been identified with a culture known as the Milograd culture, and despite me having a look around online, I could find basically no information about them that's actually been published in English. So that's a bit of a puzzling one to me. I might look into that in my own time. In the relevant passage, Herodotus states that, quote, the Neuri share the customs of Scythia. After a long break in which he discusses them being evicted from their country in the past by swarms of snakes, he then continues by saying, it appears that these people practice magic, for there is a story current amongst the Scythians and the Greeks in Scythia that once a year every Neurian turns into a wolf for a few days and then turns back into a man again. I do not believe this tale, but all the same they tell it, and even swear to the truth of it. And in an additional fun fact, in the surrounding lands, he also gives descriptions of races of goat-footed men, men that were entirely bald, one-eyed men, cannibals, and griffins.
Those weird supernatural men that were entirely bald.
Yes. Yeah, if you see one of them, you've been visited by something peculiar, you have.
Matt Lucas.
Well, yeah. Moving on from these tales, there is one big development in this time period that would come to affect the later werewolf legend, and that is in the first appearances of the term lycanthropy in the form of the word lycanthropos. According to Daniel Ogden, at the time this term specifically seems to have meant a medical condition rather than any physical transformation. According to the 2nd century CE writings of Marcellus of Side, or Side, which are mostly lost but preserved in later authors' writings, men afflicted by lycanthropy were marked by dry eyes, a listless gaze, a dry tongue, and an inability to put on weight or to produce tears. The sufferers of this disease were said to go out at night in the month of February to hang around tombs and graves. This is probably like the only real obvious association with like wolves or dogs from the period, and that there's some claims that wolves were like supposed to hang around tombs and dogs. These individuals were further recognizable by the appearance of wounds on their shins as they were continuously falling down or being bitten by dogs. Marcellus attributed their condition to melancholia, which was a condition thought to be then related to the then popular four humours theory of medicine. This temperament was said to be caused by an excess of the humour of black bile, which was said to cause such symptoms as fear, despondency, insomnia, loss of appetite, irritability, and agitation. As we're going to discuss, though, in later periods, this would become equated to a type of delusion where a person thought they were becoming a wolf. In this guise, lycanthropy would continue to be considered a treatable medical problem all the way up until the earlier 20th century. That's kind of one of the actual continuous threads that we can point to throughout Western European traditions. We'll discuss its treatment more in part 2, however, as well as historical illnesses that could be paralleled in some way to folkloric and later trial accounts of werewolves. The one element that I also want to say is I'm not sure where the word lycanthropy, like wolf part of the word, actually comes from. Like none of the sources that I actually could find gave a good explanation of that. Maybe it's on one of those false etymologies again. To conclude this section, I also want to give an honourable mention to two tales that I haven't had the time to go into today, as this episode is already going to be really long. These are the legend of Aristomenes and Philostratus's dog demon of Ephesus, which are both claimed to contain werewolf-like elements, and you're free to check them out if you like. Just want to keep them for completeness' sake. I personally see these tales, I think, from how we've outlined them here, as simply part of a wider body of folklore from this time associated with shapeshifters and wolves in general, rather than being any sort of coherent tradition of werewolves. And in order for us to kind of try and jump forward and try and track elements that probably made it more into the modern idea of the werewolf, hopefully, or at least the medieval idea of the werewolf and the early modern idea of the werewolf. I'm going to hand over to you, Cassie, to discuss the evidence for belief in werewolves throughout the medieval period.
Thank you, Charles. Yes, having seen now the earliest written origins of werewolfism, we're going to head north from the lands of the Greeks and the Romans to see origins of other types of wolfmen across Europe. So to begin with, I'm going to bring you to the lands of the Vikings. The Viking sagas contain a few descriptions of wolf-type shapeshifters, as well as an example of bestial warriors which contributed to reconstructing the Proto-Indo European wolfmen that I discussed earlier on. The written versions of the sagas, which were composed in Iceland around the 13th century after the Christianization of Scandinavia, tell of the Norse gods and of the heroes descended from them who were the ancestors of the Vikings, who went on to raid and conquer much of Britain and Northern Europe. The first saga, which I'll talk about, to contain references to wolf shapeshifters, is the Saga of the Volsungs, which is set in roughly the 5th century. This saga focuses on the great-grandson of Odin, the eponymous Volsung, and his descendants, particularly Sigmund, Signy, and Sigurd. It does have some basis, it's believed, in historical events from the 5th century, and much of the story is also found in the Middle High German epic, the Nibelungenlied, which originated from the same oral tales. There are 2 brief episodes of the Volsung saga which are relevant for today's episode, which depict the transformation into a wolf. One follows the perspective of the wolves themselves, and the other follows the victims of their attacks. This first wolf encounter is shortly after King Volsung is slain, and his 10 sons, including the hero Sigmund, are taken prisoner by his killer, King Siggeir. Signy, who is Volsung's daughter, and is also the wife of Siggeir, begs her husband to let her brothers be kept alive in stocks, believing that her prayers for their lives would be answered if she could convince the king to spare them for the time being. Her prayers, however, were not answered, for on the first night, when her brothers were in the stocks, a she-wolf appeared from the woods. Described as old and of great and evil aspect, she killed one of the brothers with a bite, ate his body, and disappeared. When Signy sent one of her men to check on the brothers, he reported this, and Signy despaired, for there was nothing that she could do to protect her brothers. For the next 8 nights, the she-wolf returned, killing and eating each of the brothers in turn, until only Sigmund remained. So, Signy sent her trusted man to Sigmund, bidding him to smear honey around Sigmund's face. When the she-wolf returned, she smelled the honey, and instead of eating him, she began to lick the honey from his face. When she did so, Sigmund bit her tongue, and clamped down hard. The wolf, in pain, attempted to pull free, but Sigmund held on so tightly that even braced with all 4 feet against the stocks, she couldn't break loose. Finally, she pulled hard enough that her feet shattered the stocks, freeing Sigmund, who still did not let go of her tongue, and her tongue was ripped clean from her mouth, and she fled. The chapter then ends by saying that it was believed that the she-wolf was in fact King Siggeir's mother, who had transformed herself by, quote, troll's law and witchcraft. How this type of witchcraft might have been done, we see sometime later in the saga. By this time, Sigmund has unknowingly fathered a son with Signy. A witch had aided Signy into tricking King Siggeir into believing that she had produced an heir by casting a spell on the pair of them to shapeshift into each other. Signy then spent 3 nights with Sigmund in this guise, while the witch took her place with Siggeir. Signy fell pregnant with Sigmund's son and named him Sinfjotli, raising him as Siggeir's son before sending him to Sigmund when he was 10 years old. Nice alliteration, I've written that. Sigmund agreed to train Sinfjotli and toughen him up with manly deeds so that he may grow into a warrior who could aid him in getting his revenge on King Siggeir. As part of this, the two went into the wilds to live as bandits and raiders, slaying men for their wealth. After some time of this, the two encountered a house in which two men were asleep, and hanging over them were a pair of wolf pelts. From these, Sigmund recognised them as skin changers, and knowing that if they wore these wolf pelts, they took on the wolf's forms for 10 days and would return to human form on the 10th day, they stole the wolf skins and donned them, taking on the form of a wolf. They understood the howling of wolves, they knew how to hunt as wolves, but they kept their own minds. For several days, they hunted together as wolves, slaying men and communicating by howling so that they could range off, and if one needed the other, they could howl and summon aid. However, Sinfjotli was wounded when he refused to call on Sigmund's aid out of pride. Sigmund treated Sinfjotli's wounds with leaves and herbs that he learned from other animals, and when the 10th day came and they could return to their human forms, they burned the wolf skins, praying that no more harm may come from them.
It becomes a kind of a common thread in later tales, doesn't it? The idea that it's an item you can like physically bind yourself in that will transform you.
Yes, there is one of those from a tale from Ireland, actually, that will come up later on.
Very common in the early modern period.
Yeah. These instances, of course, don't have one of the main elements of modern werewolf belief that we know today, namely the idea of it being a curse and the transformation being involuntary, or the aspect of the shapeshifter losing their intelligence and reasoning when transformed. There is a detailed story of this type of curse in another saga, the saga of Hrolfr Kraki, which you might remember from our Beowulf episode. In this case, the transformation is into a bear, not a wolf. However, a wolf is still relevant to the curse. In this story, Prince Bjorn, who was the son of King Hring of the northern regions of Norway, had been left to manage his father's kingdom with the aid of his stepmother, Queen Hvit, while Hring was aboard raiding. Hvit was not well liked by the people, or by Bjorn, despite the fact that she was very kind to Bjorn. Bjorn was unhappy to be left to govern the kingdom with Hvit, and she tried to console him, saying it would be much pleasanter to work together than to have an old man like Hring giving them orders. Bjorn, however, was angry and struck her for insulting his father, telling her to leave. She responded by striking him back with a wolfskin glove and cursing him to become a rabid wild bear, eating nothing but his father's sheep and terrorizing the kingdom.
I wonder where the logic jump there was. We'll hit you with the wolfskin, now you're a bear.
Yeah, I don't understand that either. I can't find anything that really explains it.
Yeah, if I was Bjorn, I'd be puzzled. Like, wait a minute, I'm what now?
Like, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily be puzzled if I was Bjorn, because Bjorn means bear.
Yeah.
So it makes sense of him going, oh, I'm a bear now.
Thanks to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, I've known that since 8 years old.
Yeah. But yeah, the connection to a wolfskin glove turning into bear is one I'm less clear of.
Yeah.
It also, I guess, might be a case of the character was named Bjorn because he turned into a bear.
Either way, it gives us a great chance to nitpick.
Yeah, which is what we do on
part
this
of the
show.
British national character.
So Bjorn, the bear man transformed by a wolf glove, went missing soon after this event. And at the same time, sheep began disappearing from nearby farms, more than a score of sheep disappearing at a time. And rumour spread around the kingdom of sightings of a large grey bear attacking them. Eventually, Bjorn's betrothed, Bera, saw this bear and recognised Bjorn's eyes. And yes, Bera is just an anagram of bear here. I think that one's less. They didn't
have thesauruses back then.
Yeah, I mean, also, again, bear wasn't the Norse word, so it's more a coincidence in this case, but just silly to notice.
The story of the bear who married the bear,
Yeah. Bears all the way down, except for the cursed glove. Back on track. Bera followed the bear to a cave, and as night fell, she found that the bear turned back into the form of Bjorn. So she remained in the cave with him for quite some time, staying each night with him. He spent each day in the form of a bear, raiding farms and stealing sheep, before reverting to human form each night. However, Eventually, hunters would go on to track him down and slay him in bear form during the day. So, Bjorn the Bear Man, who is not to be confused with Tolkien's character of a different spelling, was not the only Bjorn to be associated with shapeshifting, though he is the most fleshed out. A second Bjorn has a closer connection with wolves, though he was not a shapeshifter himself or a main character from what I can find. He's mentioned in the Holmveia saga, the saga of Hord Grimkelsen of the 10th century, a warrior of southwestern Iceland, and his travels to Norway and Götaland. Here we have a warrior who is named as Bjorn, son of Ulfhedin, the wolfskin coat, son of Ulfhammer II, the wolf-shaped, son of Ulf, the wolf, son of Ulfhammer I, also the wolf-shaped, who was known for his shape-shifting abilities.
Guy's named Wolf or the Wolf Down.
Until Bjorn the Bear.
Yeah.
Maybe there was some infidelity there. Yeah, if the milkman was also known as Bjorn.
Yeah,
then...
I'm just thinking of like a comic of two wolves, like the male wolf looking angry at his wife as a bear cub is not in front of them.
Yeah, I think I've seen similar variants of that.
I'm thinking of the Family Guy thing where he confronts like the penguin and the elephant. It's like, hey, what's this?
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. Yes, I couldn't place where it was from.
From nowhere, yeah.
On a more serious and less shapeshifty note, in the same vein as the Korios and the Vedic wolf warriors, we do have a more mundane example of wolfmen that can again easily have inspired fears of the werewolf in survivors of their attacks. Mentions of these are in a few sagas, including firstly the, wish me luck on this pronunciation, the Vatnsdæla saga, Vatsdæla saga, or the saga of the people of Vatsdala, a saga written in the late 13th century, chronicling the history of the Hof clan of the Vatsdala region of Iceland, from when the clan left Norway to the beginnings of their decline in the 11th century. Even if you only have a passing knowledge of the Vikings, you've probably heard of the idea of the berserker or berserker gang. We obviously get the term berserk from their name, implying a mindless and destructive fury. One of the better known attestations to the berserker is from Snorri Sturluson's Ynglinga saga, which I'll quote, says, Odin's men rushed forwards without their armour. They were as mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields, and were as strong as bears or wild oxen, killing people at a blow, but neither fire nor iron told upon them. This was called Berserker Gang. While Sturluson described the berserkers as being unarmoured, and the term he uses is originally interpreted as bare of shirt, bare spelt B-A-R-E, so a kenning for naked or topless, later translators instead interpret the term berserker to mean bear shirt, as in bear the animal, to imply that they wore bear skins. These berserkers were said to enter a state of wild fury, losing all rational thought, and through their rage, becoming inhumanly strong and resistant to harm. The term would be used without the bear connotation in the Vatsdæla saga, as the word became a more general term for this kind of shock troops that fought in a wild fury. The saga describes, and I quote, those berserker who were called Ulfhednir, who had got wolf skins over their mail coats. The Vatsdæla saga did include references to the supernatural, but being written closer to the time of the events depicted, it does likely contain a bit more history than the sagas such as the Volsung or the Ynglinga saga. Supernatural powers or no, it seems quite plausible for shock troops in wolfskins such as these Ulfhednir to have served King Harald Fairhair, the Hofclan's liege. These warriors also appear serving King Harald in Grettir's saga, or the saga of Grettir the Strong. The main narrative of this saga follows the 11th century outlaw Grettir Asmundason in Iceland, but the early chapters deal with his father, who served under King Harald. In Chapter 2, during a naval battle with the greatest berserker, Thorir Longchin, Harold's men board Thorir's ship, which is described as, "Then the king cried on his berserkers for an onslaught, and they were called Ulfhethnar, wolf-coats, for on them would no steel bite, and when they set on, naught might withstand them." The 9th century skaldic poem Haraldsskeiði, attributed to Thorbjorn Hornclothy, also makes 2 references to King Harold's Ulfhethnar. Stanza 8 says, "The ships were loaded with men and white shields, western spears and Frankish swords. Berserks bellowed, battle was under way for them, and wolfskins howled and brandished iron spears." While stanza 21 says, "They are called wolfskins, who bear bloody shields in combat. They redden spears when they come to war. At Harold's court they are seated together. There, I believe, he, the sovereign wise and understanding, may entrust himself to men of courage alone, those who hew into a shield." These are all quite short references, and they are spaced out over a few centuries, so whether this does represent a generally accepted fact that Harold Fairhair employed such wolf-coated warriors, or whether they each reference back to the earliest one, we can't really say. One hypothesis that is given as to how these may have influenced the werewolf is by Sabine Baring-Gould in the book Werewolves, being an account of a terrible superstition from 1865. Baring-Gould talks about the decline of the berserker as a shock trooper holding a good position in the king's armies, turning later into roving outlaws who terrorized farmers through challenging them in combat. In Norse law, he says, a man who declined to accept a challenge forfeited his possessions, even forfeiting his wife, while accepting the challenge from such a fearsome enemy meant certain death. And so, these so-called berserkers had farmers and other peasant folk at their mercy, simply based on reputation, and so the fear of a wolfman or a bear man roving the countryside could spread quite easily.
This sounds similar to the Indian warriors that we discussed before.
Yeah, though in this case, it's more clearly referencing a lone wolf,
yes,
as it were.
Rather than a gang.
Rather than a gang. Baring-Gould doesn't cite a source for this in his work, and the only such law I can find when looking into Norse law is the laws governing holmgang, or duels, in which a challenge is given either in response to an insult to one's honour, after failure to repay a debt, to avenge a friend or family member, or due to a legal disagreement. However, the status of outlaw in Norse society was also a legal status referring to one who had been banished and was treated as dead to all society, therefore could own no property and had no right to demand a duel or payment from a dishonoured party. Essentially, I think that Baring-Gould might have oversimplified Norse law regarding duels and honour here, but I also think that Norse law doesn't need to be brought into the matter anyway. As we've said earlier on, a big scary man in wolfskin is still quite a terrifying figure, even if there was no legal backing to his decision to challenge you. He doesn't need to worry about the legal minutiae of challenging an untrained farmer to a fight for his property. So if Baring-Gould is accurate about berserkers operating in this way, it's simply a matter of strength and fearsome reputation. If this is also accurate about how later berserkers and Ulfhethnar would go on to live after the Norse kingdoms became more peaceful and there was less need for shock troops, this does make more sense to me as the point where wolf warriors begin to morph into monstrous werewolves, more so than the previous suggestion of full bands of warriors as raiders. An individual wolfman attacking and killing a farmer for his property is a much closer story to the idea of a single werewolf attacking a village intermittently. And it's also a much easier story to spread and mutate because there'll be much more survivors from one outlaw just trying to sustain themselves than a whole raiding band. And so it's possible for these kind of raids to last longer and spread further over time. Obviously, we can never know if that's what occurred, but Baring-Gould making this connection is logical to me. Roughly contemporary to the Norse references to wolf shapeshifters and wolf warriors, we also find hints at werewolf activity in Celtic legend. Much like the Icelandic sagas, the written sources here come from authors writing several centuries after the fact. Several medieval sources make reference to wolf warriors of Ossory, a small kingdom in Ireland covering modern-day County Laois and County Kilkenny. Originally, Ossory was the western region of the province of Leinster, before becoming independent for a time in the 9th century, and so it existed as a distinct cultural region from the 1st through to the 12th century. There are a few variations on the stories of the werewolves of Ossory, as they are referred to in modern sources. The first is a genealogy, the Cor Amnon, or Fitness of Names, written in late Middle Irish, so around the 12th century. Here it names the first of the kings of Ossory, Lognach Fealad, claiming that he and his descendants could shapeshift into wolves. It's a short passage, so to quote it in full, Lognach Fealad, that is, the man that used to shift into a Fealad, or wolf shape, he and his offspring after him used to go, whenever they pleased, into the shapes of the wolves, and, after the custom of wolves, kill the herds. Wherefore he was called Lognach Fealad, for he was the first of them to go into a wolf shape. Other genealogies name him as the brother of the first king of Ossory, Ferdrach MacDuch, rather than the king himself. A later chronicle, the Book of Ballymote, written in the 14th century at Ballymote Castle in County Sligo, names the people of Ossory as descendants of the wolf, and so that they have the power to shapeshift. While not explicitly named as being from Ossory, a tribe believed to be referring to the people of Ossory is said to have opposed St. Patrick in his work to bring Christianity to Ireland. The 13th century Norse book, Kongs Skugsio, or Speculum Regale, as the Latin version is titled, described a wondrous thing which will seem very untruthful to men, but says that the Irish people attested to the truth of the story. It is claimed that when St. Patrick came to Ireland to preach Christianity, that there was one tribe more hostile to him than all others who attempted to thwart his work. When he preached in their lands, this tribe would come as if to listen to his word and take his counsel, but instead would howl like wolves, attempting to drown him out. St. Patrick, angered by this, prayed that God might have vengeance on them for interfering with his word, such that even their descendants would suffer the punishment. God granted this prayer, and the book says that all men descended from that tribe are always wolves at a certain time, and run into the woods and take food like wolves, and they are worse in that they have human reason, for all their cunning, and such desire and greed as men for other creatures. And it is said that some become so every 7th year, and are men during the interval, and some have it so long that they have 7 years at once, and are never so afterward. The Welsh historian Nennius of Bangor also quotes a poem, The Men Who Changed Themselves into Wolves, in the Irish version of Historia Britonum, which states that the descendants of the wolf are from Ossory. In this version, he implies, instead of physically changing into the shape of the wolves, that they instead use what we might now call astral projection, projecting their spirit, either physically projecting a spirit in the shape of a wolf, or projecting their spirit to possess a wolf. Here they exclusively attack livestock and flee from any human resistance, and are as vulnerable as regular wolves, rather than exhibiting any monstrous characteristics attributed to some of the Norse sources and later ideas of werewolves. The most detailed account of the werewolves of Ossory comes from Gerald of Wales, whose 1188 book, the Topographica Hibernica, or Topography of Ireland, we mentioned last time as being a highly influential, completely fictional, and very insulting account of the people of Ireland, shaping British attitudes to the Irish for several centuries in a way that was definitely not favourable to the Irish. His second book, The Conquest of Ireland, is often included as a part 2 to the Topographia, and in it, Gerald presents the chapter, which he titles Of the Prodigies of Our Times, and the first of a wolf which conversed with a priest. Here, he tells of an encounter which allegedly happened 3 years before Earl John arrived in Ireland, placing it around 1174, before King Henry appointed his son John as Lord of Ireland in 1177. A priest travelling from Ulster had made camp in a forest on the borders of County Meath. Sat by his fire, a wolf approached and spoke to the priest, telling him not to be afraid. The wolf then added, quote, some orthodox words referring to God, and the priest ordered him in God's name to do no harm to them, and tell them how an animal could speak human words. The wolf, giving proper Catholic responses to the names of God and the Holy Trinity, told the following story. There are 2 of us, a man and a woman, natives of Ossory, who through the curse of one Natalis, saint and abbot, are compelled every 7 years to put off the human form and depart from the dwellings of men. Quitting entirely the human form, we assume that of wolves. At the end of the 7 years, if they chance to survive, 2 others being substituted in their places, they return to their county and their former shape. And now, she who is my partner in this visitation lies dangerously sick not far from hence, and, as she is at the point of death, I beseech you, inspired by divine charity, to give her the consolations of your priestly office. The wolf led the priest to a tree a short distance off, with a she-wolf concealed in a hollow beneath it, making very human noises of pain. The wolf gave thanks to God that he had sent her salvation, and begged the priest to perform the last rites. The priest began to perform the rites, however, stopped before performing the last communion. When the wolves urged him to give Holy Communion, the priest insisted that he had not been provided with the consecrated wafers as part of his travelling supplies. The male wolf, observing from a short distance away, approached again, and pointed to a supply of consecrated wafers in a container hung from his neck, under his robe. He further implored the priest to grant her Holy Communion, and demonstrated her true humanity by using his claw to rip the wolf skin from her upper body and fold it back, revealing the body of an old woman underneath. The priest, terrified, did as he was bid, giving Holy Communion. The wolf then recovered his companion in her wolfskin, and she died. The wolf remained with the priest at camp throughout the night, behaving more like a man than an animal, and in the morning led them some way through the forest. He thanked the priest for going their separate ways, for his blessing, and promised that if he were to survive his 7-year curse, he would repay the priest for his aid. Weirdly, Gerald then decides to give the wolf the power of prophecy and use him as a mouthpiece for some anti-Irish propaganda, when out of nowhere, the priest asks the wolf whether the hostile race, the Norman invaders from Britain, would succeed in their invasion and establish themselves in Ireland. The wolf gives this reply. For the sins of our nation and their enormous vices, the anger of the Lord, falling on an evil generation, hath given them into the hands of their enemies. Therefore, as long as this foreign race shall keep the commandments of the Lord and walk his ways, it will be secure and invincible. But if, as the downward path to illicit pleasures is easy, and nature is prone to follow vicious examples, this people shall chance, from living among us, to adopt our depraved habits, doubtless they will provoke divine vengeance on themselves also. So, as tends to happen, an Irish legend here has been hijacked by the British in order to paint the Irish as sinners and in need of good Christian English rule.
Yes, that sounds like something that...
That sounds like what Gerald would do.
Yeah.
And the English as a whole.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this account is that, allegedly, it was not only presented in Gerald's propaganda book, but was also detailed in letters to the Pope, at the time Pope Alexander III. So Gerald goes on to explain that about 2 years after the event, so in 1176, he was passing through Meath at the time when the Bishop of Meath had convened a synod of neighbouring bishops and abbots in order to make a judgment on what was to be done about the priest who had given Holy Communion to a woman cursed to be transformed into a wolf. The bishop had heard that Gerald was in the region and had sent 2 clerks with a message requesting his presence to advise on the matter, or to send his opinion in writing if he was unable to attend in person. The clerks told the full tale to him, though he claimed that he was previously familiar with it from other sources. Gerald was travelling on urgent business, and so had to send his advice by letter. The bishop and the synod deferred to his judgment, and ordered the priest to appear before the Pope with a letter from the bishop detailing the encounter and the judgment, and to give the Pope his confession. Sadly, if the letter is in the parts of the Vatican archive that have so far been digitised, I can't find it, unfortunately. Gerald did draw on the works of St. Augustine that you described earlier, Charles, in deciding whether a man in wolf form is to be considered a beast or a man. He cites Augustine's discussion of fantastical creatures and whether they must be seen as human in the eyes of God. This refers to the Arcadians, also referring to men from Asia with the heads of dogs, an example from Italy of women who could use magical ingredients in cheese to transform any who consumed it into beasts of burden. And he then himself makes a comparison to the book The Golden Ass, which you mentioned earlier, specifically describing how the writer had just such an experience happen to him. He consumed some potion and was changed into an ass. I can conclude that that one is a completely accurate account. To this day, people can and do consume a potion which can turn them into an ass.
Pinocchio, for one.
A more modern potion.
Yeah.
Purchasable at many establishments.
Trying to keep this family friendly.
Yes, Pinocchio. Joking aside, Augustine concluded here that true reason declares that whatever answers to the definition of a man as a rational and mortal animal, whatever be its form, is to be considered a man. St. Augustine says trans rights. Gerald also takes this to mean that, in the eyes of God, a cursed human, cursed to become a wolf, is still a human, and so is worthy of Christian rights, forgiveness from Christ, and entry into heaven, even after the vices which brought the curse on them. So we're sponsored by Gerald's Welsh Lager today. Drink responsibly. So before we leave Ireland for Britain, France and Germany, I have one more story of Irish werewolves to tell, though this one is not connected to the werewolves of Ossory. For this story, we return to Connaught province, which featured heavily last time, and head to County Roscommon, in the time of the Fianna cycle, the cycle of Finn MacCool and his companions. The story is found in the Middle Irish text, A Calam na Senara, originally written in the 13th century, though the earliest surviving manuscripts are from the 15th century. This is one of the most important texts in the Fianna cycle, in which the warriors of the Fianna have survived into St. Patrick's time and relate their stories to him. Two chieftains of the Fianna, Finn's nephew, Calta Macronan, and the bard Cascora, unconfirmed whether they were known as the Victorious, were travelling through Roscommon to meet the newly arrived St. Patrick. On the road, they encountered the steward of the region, Barna MacCarb, at the hill of Carnfree. He and his lands were beset by many problems, including a woman of the she-folk stealing cattle, whom Cascora dealt with in short order. After bringing her head to Barna, they were told of Barna's next problem, 3 she-wolves from the cave of Crochan, who every year kill all the rams and sheep they own before fleeing back to their cave faster than Barna's men could mount defence.
Oh, I've not heard this in relation to the cave at Cruachan.
No, I hadn't either until I read this, actually. These she-wolves, he said, were the 3 daughters of a man named Arta, the chieftain of a raiding company from Crochan, and that it is easier to raid for them as wolves now than as people. Calta asked if they would trust anyone to approach them, and Barna said that they would only allow men with harps and dulcimers to approach them. Fortunately for Barna, Cascora was a bard, famed as a performer for the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Irish gods, and renowned for playing the dulcimer. This is a bit of an anachronism from the 15th century manuscripts and their translations, as the hammered dulcimer as we know it only appears in the 15th century onwards. Early modern Irish music referred to the hammered dulcimer under the name of the timpan. which came from an earlier instrument recorded in medieval Ireland, speculated to be a type of lyre or long-necked lute.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, with his instrument, Cascora was directed to the nearby cairn of Brickrew, a hill where the sound would carry to the wolf's lair.
Brickrew the trickster, I'm guessing?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, that we discussed in the Q-Con episode.
Early the next morning, he set off and played his dulcimer from atop the cairn throughout the day. In the late afternoon, 3 wolves approached him and lay down, listening to the music. However, he could not attack them without stopping the music. So, the next day, Calta told him that he should return and tell them that it would be better for them to listen in human form rather than the shape of wolves. When the wolves returned to listen, he told them this, and they removed their wolfskins, which they wore as cloaks to transform. Entranced by the music, they lay together, side by side, and did not notice Calta and his envenomed spear. With a mighty throw, he skewered all 3 together. Cascora went to where they lay and cut off their heads, and from then the cairn of Brickrew was renamed the Valley of the Wolf Shapes. So far, in Scandinavia and Ireland, we have encountered 3 archetypes of wolf shapeshifters. Both Norse and Irish legends tell of people who wore wolfskins in order to transform them into wolves for raiding. Sigmund and Sinfjotla in Scandinavia, and the daughters of Arata in Ireland. Both have animal shapeshifting as a curse, though Scandinavia only has Bjorn the Bearman rather than wolf shapeshifting, while in Ireland, the story of humans cursed to take on wolf form has several incarnations, all of which have the wolves of Ossory cursed by God, while older sources on Ossory suggest that wolf shapeshifting being a power granted to kings and warriors. This is also applied to astral projection of a wolf form instead of shapeshifting, an ability that there are a few scattered references to in Scandinavian sources that I haven't gone into detail of for time.
Mm-hmm.
We also have non-shapeshifting wolf warriors in Scandinavia wearing wolfskins and entering a battle rage. In short, it seems that both Celtic and Norse paganism considered the ability to shift into wolves or to fight with the mind and ferocity of wolves to be a power worthy of great warriors. The move towards wolf shapeshifting as a curse and the ostracization of Norse wolf warriors seems to line up with the spread of Christianity in Norse and Celtic countries, with even sources which show shapeshifting as a power used by warriors depicting these warriors as villains by this time.
Yeah, it would make sense that the coming of Christianity did change things a bit,
And that continues in the remainder of my section as we head into Britain and mainland Europe.
So far what I'm hearing, Cassie, is that there doesn't appear to be any great continuity from the classical traditions with wolf transformation. There's still a few elements in there, but there's very few citations of like those older classical stories as inspiring these fusions, which makes sense.
That is basically right, We can find similar ideas even when we're talking about the same story. So say the Werewolves of Ossory, there is a lot of variation depending on who is telling the story. So we can't really say that there is a continuity even within Ireland itself.
Because I'm trying to keep track of this idea that you do get occasion saying with some scholars that there was some sort of tradition of werewolves that stretches throughout time. I just don't think we really have that fundamentally.
No, it's a lot of things where I guess they're trying to join dots even though there's a lot of space between them.
It does eventually start to all get mushed together into a general concept, but even then, as we'll see when I talk about the early modern period, it's still a bit malleable. But sorry, you keep going.
Yeah, it does still feel more like a retrospective thing than the idea that there was this continuity that we are just observing.
Yeah.
As we move a bit forward in time and into mainland Europe, in 11th century Germany, we see the church acknowledge the belief in, but not the existence of necessarily, werewolves. In fact, it's a book of church law in which the term werewolf may have been first recorded.
Oh, nice.
By Burchard von Worms in his Decretum, which is 20 books setting down canon law of the church. I can only find the quote in Latin. I am relying on Google Translate for this, as I haven't had the time to learn Latin, unfortunately. But it reads as follows.
Alas, they told us in school it would be useful, and it turned out
Turned out it was, and I didn't learn it.
Took us 35 years to learn it.
Don't tell them I'm 35.
Wow.
Took me 25.
That'll be changing soon.
Anyway, the quote.
Yeah.
Have you believed, as some are wont to believe, that those who are commonly called fates are themselves or can do what they believe, when a man is born, that when they are able to designate him to do what they wish, so that whenever that man wishes, he can be transformed into a wolf, which common folly calls a werewolf, or into some other figure. That is a grammatical mess.
Yes.
And I'm fairly certain it was just as bad in Latin. Because, yeah.
Just because you can write in Latin doesn't mean that you're a good writer.
Yeah. It was the same amount of text in writing and English. English is not adding all of those extra connecting bits that weren't necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was probably bad in Latin as well. An alternative claim to the initial coining of the term werewolf is another source contemporary to Burchard von Worms. This is the ecclesiastical ordinances of Canute the Great of Norway, Denmark, and England. Article 26 of his ordinances reads as follows, and I do have an English translation for this one, and it's much better grammatically. Bishops are messengers and teachers of God's laws, and they are to earnestly preach and set an example of spiritual duty. Heed them who will. For a weak shepherd is found when he does not defend with a shout the flock that is in his care, if a predator comes to prey upon it. There is no predator as evil as the devil himself. He is only concerned with one thing, how he can injure the souls of men. Therefore, shepherds must be ever watchful and diligently cry out to shield their people against the predator. These are the bishops and the priests, who are to oversee and defend their spiritual flocks with wise instruction. So, the madly voracious werewolf does not wound too greatly nor consume too many of their spiritual flock. And he who does not heed the messengers of God will have to answer to God himself. May the name of God be blessed forever, and praise and honour and glory to be him eternally. Amen. I see this one sometimes cited as being literal, about literal werewolves, but unlike Burchard of Worms' quote, this one, when you look at the full thing, is clearly not referring to literal werewolves, and instead extending the metaphor of the priest as the shepherd of God's flock, and the evildoer as the predator, a man acting as a wolf. According to Charlotte Otten, while not referring to a physical transformation, or even to a change in the minds of men referred to as werewolves, as may be suggested about the Ulfheðnar, it is still an indication of deeper changes in the nature of the evils that the priest must defend against. So in scripture, the use of the shepherd-flock-predator metaphor sticks to describing the predator simply as a wolf. For example, in Acts 20:21, "For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock." Otten alleges that this choice of wording separates the acts of evil done by the wolves from human agency. The wolf is instead the agent of Satan, whether the man wills it or not. By shifting the language instead to the werewolf, and explicitly making the man a part of the spiritual evil, it indicates a more willing alliance with Satan. Satan may corrupt the spirit into that of a beast, but through willing human collaboration, and so both aspects of that nature are hinted at here. Yeah,
the idea that the man actually retains his mind and has agency in these evil deeds is an increasingly strong point going forwards in the medieval period and into the early modern period.
Yeah, I believe you have a lot more on that to come later, yes. While Burchard von Worms had warned of people who believed that they could physically transform into wolves, other sources from around this time are quite scattered. The next chronological mention that I can find, which does explicitly use the word werewolf, is in Gervase of Tilbury's Otia Imperiala, an encyclopedia written in 1212. Gervase wrote this book for Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV after he was appointed Marshal of the Kingdom of Burgundy-Arles in the Holy Roman Empire. It's quite a small reference, but in the scheme of things, it is a very important one, as it is the first that I can find in medieval writings which explicitly links werewolves with the cycle of the moon. Again, the only version of this quote that I can find is in Latin. The book is only available online in Latin, and the only source that quotes it, The Werewolf in Lore and Legend, is written by a man who has an annoying habit of not translating his quotations. Yes. I am again relying on Google Translate, but from the Latin words I do recognise, I think it gets the gist of it. We have frequently seen in England men mutate into wolves during lunations, which is an old word for the lunar cycle, which genus of men the Gauls call Werewolves, while the English call werewolves. As with Burchard von Worms, this is in a religious context. While Burchard is discussing men who believed that they were given the evil ability to turn into wolves by fate, Gervais instead has this in a chapter titled On the Eyes Being Opened After Sin. It's a brief reference. He sadly does not go into detail on the nature of these werewolves, instead just going on to list other transformations inflicted on sinful people. But considering how this particular trait has survived in folklore and fiction for some 800 years, then it is logical to suggest Gervais was referencing a more common belief at the time.
I don't know, because as far as I'm aware, after the medieval period, this thread does not get picked up again until the movie Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman.
Really?
It might literally be a coincidence, but I don't really know. We'll have to look into more into that in part 2.
I was actually wondering if you were going to bring the moon in more in your section. No, so I was wrong. Wow.
Does not appear in my section whatsoever, coming for the early modern period.
The fact that we've not actually traded scripts at this point is becoming evident.
Yeah, it is. I think that's kind of interesting. It's similar to the King Arthur situation we had when we recorded that, where we're learning as we go.
We're learning as we go and breaking misconceptions again, which is fun. Roughly contemporary with Gervais of Tilbury's short but quite important mention of the werewolf, we have a hugely different werewolf tale that is probably one of the most detailed from the Middle Ages. This particular story is one of the French romances of Arthurian canon, following the tale of one of King Arthur's knights by the name of Melion. And to not let a subset of our fanbase get their hopes up, a romance might be the name of the genre of French literature, and it features stories of love and chivalry between knights and maidens, but it's definitely not what modern media would describe as a werewolf romance. I'm very sorry. Maybe there is a French noble who had an archive of their own such stories, but that won't come up today. In this story, King Arthur has conquered or united England. His knights are renewing their knightly vows, not as allegiance to their king, but vows of the virtues that they would personally keep as knights. The knight Melion gives one particular vow, that he would never love a woman, no matter how noble and pretty she was, who had loved or spoken of any other man. The women of the court were quite angered by this vow, and they all agreed, more than 100 of them, to never speak to him or even look at him again. Can't argue. Because of this, Melion fell into a depression and did not wish to seek adventure again.
Oh no, I'm depressed over the consequences of my own actions.
Yeah. It's a good job he didn't have the internet.
Yeah.
Arthur, seeing his depression, granted him one of his castles by the sea, with beautiful woods surrounding it for hunting, where he may stay and recover from his depression. Melion retired to this castle and grew to love the surrounding country greatly, spending most of his time in the forests. One day, a year or so after taking up residence there, he and his squire were out hunting a great stag. Stopping in a clearing, Melion saw an incredibly beautiful woman riding a palfrey, wearing a dress of scarlet samite worthy of a queen. She was the daughter of the King of Ireland, and it was never explained why she was riding alone in this forest here. But she was. For both of them, it was love at first sight, with the woman saying to him, "I would never wish to love another except you alone." Melion was overjoyed that he had found a woman whom he could love without breaking his vow, and they married shortly after. For 3 years they were together, and she bore him 2 sons. One day, he took her hunting with him, with his squire carrying his weapons. As they entered a great clearing, he pointed out a large stag. She told him that if she could not have the stag, she would never eat again, and she fell into a swoon. And so he told her this: "Lady, mercy, for God's sake, don't weep any longer, I beg you. I have on my hand such a ring, see it here on my middle finger. It has 2 stones in the mounting. No one ever saw any made like these. One is white, the other scarlet. You may hear a great marvel of them. Touch me with the white stone, place it on my head when I have undressed completely. I will become a wolf, great and running. For love of you, I will catch the stag and bring you some of the fat. For God's sake, I beg you, wait for me here and guard my clothes. I leave you with my life and death. There will be no comfort for me if I am touched with the other ring, for I will never be a man again." He went into the trees for privacy, disrobed, and emerged with just his cloak covering his dignity. His wife touched him with the ring, and, as he had told, he transformed into a wolf. Off he went, chasing down the stag, but the stag was fast, and his chase was long before he finally caught it. As soon as he disappeared into the forest, his wife said to the squire, "Now we'll leave him to hunt." Leaving his clothes behind, she and the squire mounted up and left together, not returning to the castle, and instead going straight to the harbour, taking the next ship she could to Dublin, to be welcomed back to her father's castle. Melion, after killing the stag and carrying its meat in his mouth, returned to find his wife gone. Though he was in the body of a wolf, he kept his human reasoning, and was able to correctly guess that she was returning to Ireland. He followed to the port and was able to sneak aboard another ship being loaded. For a year, he lived in the mountains of Ireland, killing the subjects and the livestock of the king and laying waste to the land. A pack grew around him until he had 10 wolves following him. Eventually, one peasant managed to escape their predations and fled to the king, telling him where to find the wolves that had been terrorizing his lands. The king set out to hunt them, but was only able to kill the 10 regular wolves. Melion escaped. In his escape, Melion climbed to the peak of a mountain overlooking the sea and saw a sight which gave him hope: ships bearing the heraldry of King Arthur and his knights. I typoed ships. I put a T in there where I shouldn't. Oops. It's a good job I corrected that in my head as I went. When the king landed, Melion followed him and his knights to their lodging and, unafraid, entered and fell at Arthur's feet. Arthur thought this sight a marvel and took this docile wolf under his protection. The wolf would not leave Arthur's side as he travelled to Dublin to meet with the King of Ireland, even sleeping at Arthur's feet. When the King of Ireland held a great feast to honour King Arthur, the wolf sat with him in the banquet hall, and all were impressed by the tame wolf. However, as the meal was served, Melion saw in the middle of the hall the squire who had ridden with them on the day he was transformed. Immediately, rage seized him, and he leapt upon the squire, ready to rip his throat out. The guards reacted, and surrounded the wolf before he could, but King Arthur ordered them to not dare touch him, for the wolf was his. One of Arthur's knights backed this up, stating that if the wolf had no reason to hate the lad, he would not have touched him. Arthur then interrogated the squire, pinned beneath the wolf, demanding that he confess why the wolf would attack him so, or else he will die. The squire confessed the whole story of how the lady had turned Melion into a wolf before abandoning him and returning to Ireland. Arthur demanded that the King of Ireland bring out his daughter and have her bring the ring. Melion immediately recognised it, and when it was handed to Arthur, he went to his king and kissed his feet. For his dignity, Arthur took him to a private chamber and had clothes brought for him before placing the ring on the wolf's head. His form immediately changed, restoring Melion to his former self, and Melion and Arthur both wept at their reunion. Returning to the Great Hall, the King of Ireland allowed Arthur to punish his daughter as he saw fit. Melion wished to inflict the same fate on her, turning her into a wolf, but Arthur forbade it, for the sake of his children. However, when they returned to England, Melion left with Arthur and left his wife behind, to never be loved as he loved her again.
Sad story.
Yeah. This theme would be seen in other French works, particularly the Breton lay subgenre of French Romance literature. The lay Bisclavre by Marie de France, named for the Breton word for werewolf, which means wolf-sick, follows roughly the same story as Melion. The knight is named Bisclavre rather than Melion, has no affiliation to King Arthur, and his lycanthropy is an ongoing condition as he disappears into the forest on a weekly basis. When his wife finds out his secret, she steals his clothing which prevents him from returning to human form. And following this, the story plays out in basically the same way as Melion. Two others follow the same story and retain the connection to King Arthur, stories named Biclarel and Gorlagon. I have no idea if that's how it's pronounced. Outside of France, werewolf stories don't seem to have survived much from this time. While we have the references to werewolves from Burchard of Worms and Gervase of Tilbury to suggest that belief in werewolves was prevalent enough to be addressed, records don't seem to have survived. Sabine Baring-Gould hypothesizes that this is due to suppression by the church, which would track with Burchard's attitude, and with the final source I'll be citing before I hand over to you, Charles. In the 15th century, the Inquisition of the Catholic Church was gaining more power throughout Europe. Fear of witchcraft and devil worship was on the rise, though not yet near the peak of its influence. Heretics were being hunted and put to death. In 1478, the infamous Spanish Inquisition was founded, and 9 years later, German Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer of the Archdiocese of Salzburg published one of the most influential treatises on demonology and witchcraft that will be used by inquisitors for the next few centuries, the Malleus Maleficarum. While controversial among the clergy and even other inquisitors at the time, it was endorsed by Pope Innocent VIII, despite recommending torture to extract confessions from witches and heretics, and burning alive as punishment. One section of the book bears the title, "What is thought of wolves which sometimes seize and eat men and children out of their cradles, whether this is also a glamour caused by witches." Initially, it discusses regular wolves possessed by the devil, which may happen with or without the magic of witches. Without the magic of witches, this is said to in fact be God punishing a nation for sin, as described in Leviticus 26. "If ye do not heed my commandments, I will send the beasts of the field against you, for shall consume you and your flocks." Kramer then follows with a story he allegedly learned from a man named William of Paris, the story of a man who was ensorcelled into believing he was a werewolf. This man would, on several occasions, go into hiding among caves outside the city. Here he would remain unconscious, and he would see himself as a wolf, raiding towns and eating children. Children were indeed reported to have been eaten by a wolf on these nights. But what Kramer explains truly happened was that the devil himself possessed this wolf, driving it to feed on children, and the visions were then sent to the unconscious man so that he believed that he was himself the werewolf, until eventually he was found senseless and raving in the woods. This, Kramer explains, is a thing that the devil delights in, and that pagan stories of people transformed into wolves were in fact illusions sent by the devil, making them falsely believe that they were in fact werewolves, when a true transformation can only be done by the work of God alone. While this particular account is a short one, and makes it clear that the man in question was not in fact a werewolf but under an illusion, this is far from the last time that we see a connection between witch hunters and werewolves. To learn more on that, I will hand back over to Charles, who's going to take us through werewolf belief in the early modern period from the 16th century onwards.
Okay, thank you, Cassie. Yeah, there's also going to be a little bit of an overlap into the 15th as well, as I'll need to talk about some longer term trends. But I think there's about 3 or 4 major trends there that have kind of appeared during that time that you've discussed that do carry on into the early modern period. So the idea that someone can become like physically transformed into a wolf by being given an item that performs the transformation. The idea it could be some sort of pact with the devil, potentially. Also the idea that rather than there being a physical transformation, it is a type of delusion that's brought upon the bearer. And those are all kind of elements that we'll see further development in the early modern period, which, you say, begins from around the turn of 1500. Okay, so in addition to moving forwards chronologically, we're going to move on to another major trend of werewolves in the early modern period, which is their growing unfortunate association with the witch trials of the early modern period that Cassie, you started to outline there. So as you mentioned, this wave of witch trials began to ramp up throughout parts of Europe during the 15th century, hit a peak during the 17th century and then gradually faded away over the course of the 18th century. Werewolf trials saw a similar but less widespread pattern throughout countries such as France, Switzerland, the Netherlands, the Spanish Netherlands, Austria, the region of Livonia in the Baltics, and some parts of Germany. In popular culture, the number of people accused of being werewolves during this time is usually vastly inflated. As Willem de Blacourt explores in his article, The Differentiated Werewolf, a popular number that gets bandied around is 30,000. In reality, however, only the names of about 300 accused have been reliably documented throughout this time span, with the vast majority of the accused being male. This total derives from the work of the late German writer Elmar Lore, who before his death tallied 280 names of accused. Willem de Blacourt, theorizes that obviously, because some of the names won't have survived, maybe something in the region of 500 would then be a reasonable estimate for the amount of people who were persecuted for being werewolves during this time. Further mapping of the accused by Blacourt and their cases indicates that these trials likely began in the 15th century in Switzerland, spread from there into Burgundy, then crossed over into the Rhineland in the late 16th century, from where they spread throughout wider Germany and eventually into Austria. Few to none of these trials took place throughout Eastern Europe, which is despite the later popular idea that werewolves seem to originate from the region. This is probably due to them being later conflated with vampires, which did have genuine Eastern European roots. As far as I can tell, there's nothing before the actual modern period from Eastern Europe that seems to be unique folklore, and even then, that folklore may have been influenced by folklore from this period, as best we can tell.
Yeah, I tried to find anything from Eastern Europe, and the only thing I could find was someone had badly translated a metaphor to say dude transformed into wolf when it was more just describing him as wolf-like. Yeah.
I think there are a couple of minor things, but they may be more likely to be describing creatures that are probably vampires instead, but I haven't looked into that in detail. So, detailed accounts of many werewolf trials are quite scarce, which perhaps is why, according to Blacourt, they have seen relatively little in the way of academic study, with the exception of 1 to 2 individuals that we're going to talk about later. In what accounts we do have, though, we often see people being accused of physically transforming into wolves under the influence of the devil, often as the result of some type of unholy bargain. The 2 main crimes these individuals were regularly accused of were murder, often of women and children, and cannibalism. So to give an example, in 1521, 2 men named Pierre Bogor and Michel Verdun, collectively known as the Poligny werewolves, were accused of witchcraft and cannibalism and tried before the Inquisitor General of Besancon. I apologize for all these French pronunciations. The men confessed to having assumed the form of wolves, and in that form murdered and cannibalized 2 children. During the trial, Pierre confessed to having made a bargain with a black horseman who gave him protection, money, and who found some sheep he had lost in return for swearing to follow his master, which was the devil. Later, he made an additional deal in exchange for more money, where he and Michel were turned into wolves after smearing themselves with a special salve. In this form, the 2 further confessed to have murdered and cannibalized 2 young children. Similarly, in 1573, Giles Garnier, known as the Werewolf of Dole, confessed to the murder and cannibalization of multiple children after he met a phantom man in a remote and haunted spot in the woods. This phantom apparently taught him how to transform into a wolf or a lion, which again could be induced with the use of a special unguent or salve. Outside of cannibalism and murder, other scholars such as Charlotte Otten have also sought to emphasize the sexual nature of werewolf attacks, claiming that accounts from trials of the time include detailed descriptions of sexual assault, and she also placed rape before cannibalism in her list of concepts associated with werewolf in the introduction to the volume A Lycanthropy Reader. Willem de Blacourt disputes this, arguing that Otten's conclusion is actually just based on cherry-picking of the well-known werewolf accounts, which are in Sabine,
Sabine Baring-Gould.
Yeah, Sabine Baring-Gould's compilation in the 19th century. And a full examination of the wider body of known werewolf trial accounts does not bear this out. Exactly how the idea of transformation into a wolf became associated with the wider European witch trials is uncertain. In his article, How the Werewolf Came Upon the Witches, Elmar Laurie would argue that the werewolf was considered a pre-existing part of life during the first stages of the European witch trials that was separate from the devil and that later became subject to persecution. As we've seen, though, with the later authors that you discussed, that concept already seems to have been appearing by that time anyway. Willem de Blucourt again argues against this position, pointing out that connected concepts such as cannibalism already appear to have been linked to werewolves in the earliest Swiss trials in the early 15th century. Another possibility is that it may have originated from the early association of witches with the practicing of witch riding, or even transforming into wolves themselves. Exactly what witch riding was appears to be like a slightly confused concept, so I haven't gone into it any further here. I wasn't able to find anything conclusive.
Hey folks, it's Charles here again with another quick correction. The concept I'm discussing here is actually called wolf riding, not witch riding. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense.
According to Elmar Laurie, examples of this practice have been seen in witch trials in the early 15th century, such as in Basel, Basel, is that how it's actually pronounced? The city?
Yeah, Basel, yeah.
Basel, in 1423 and 1433, in Lucerne in 1450, and in Valais in 1482. Here we also see examples of women who supposedly confessed to transforming into wolves in order to, quote, race through the mountains, dislodge snowdrifts, or to harm their neighbours' livestock. So it may simply have been a practice attributed to witches already that later became its own standalone form of persecution. So during the course of these trials, there appear to have been a number of different attitudes towards the ideas of what werewolves actually physically constituted. In addition to the inquisitors, witchfinders, and civil authorities who persecuted these individuals, there were a number of authors from the time who argued that people could indeed physically transform into wolves to commit the crimes they were accused of, though the precise mechanism of this often differed. So Cassie, as you mentioned in the Malus Maleficorum, it was thought to be possible for a man to be physically transformed into a wolf, though in this case it was seen as a punishment from God rather than something caused by the devil. Later in 1580, Jean Bodin also published the highly influential book, this is a great title, on the demonomania of the sorcerers, which described werewolves as a real phenomena. Quote, the most difficult thing to believe, and the most wonderful, is the changing of the human figure into a beast and even more from one body into another. Nonetheless, the trials conducted of witches and the divine and human histories of all peoples are undeniable proof. He would go on to describe numerous werewolf trials, including the two which I mentioned before, accuse an unspecified Christian king of being a werewolf, and also claim that there were plenty of werewolves in Constantinople. According to Willem de Blucourt, in the differentiated werewolf, in the 15th century, the French demonologists Peter Mamoris and Nicolas Jacquier also wrote influential tomes on this matter, but sadly I couldn't find English translations of either, so I'm just having to take his word for it. Outside of these writers, though, there were also many other scholars who denied the idea that any form of physical transformation was involved in these cases. According to the introduction to Otton's A Lycanthropy Reader, the question of whether it was possible for a man or a woman to transform in such a fashion became wrapped up in wider metaphysical questions from the period, along with the actual powers and capabilities of the devil. A lot of scholars seem to have held that the idea that the devil was capable of transforming humans in such a fashion was in itself sacrilegious, as this ability to create new matter would put his powers on a par with God. The result was that these different writers and religious denominations took a number of different positions regarding individuals who either claimed to be or were charged with being werewolves. The first of these was that these individuals were simply suffering from some sort of medical delusion. This theory was supported by what, according to Charlotte Otton, is the first English work to use the word lycanthropy, which is Reginald Scott's 1584 The Discovery of Witchcraft. Despite its title, in his work, Scott rejected the idea that werewolfism was associated with any physical transformation, instead using ancient medical theories to classify it instead as a type of delusion, known as lupina melancholia or lupina insania. For this, Scott again cites the ancient Greek medical opinions that I mentioned before to back up his theory, and takes the time in his work to dispute the credibility of accounts of what he describes as witchmongers, arguing against the idea that there was any biblical basis for such a transformation. Similarly, King James I of England's demonology includes a section on men-wolves, in which he argues that werewolves are neither the work of demons or spirits, but simply humans with melancholic conditions. So there were some kind of enlightened opinions that saw it kind of as a mental health or physical health issue. A second category of beliefs was that whilst the devil did not alter people into beast-like forms, he could inflict delusions on witches that they had transformed into such creatures. So you mentioned that before in your section. Another example of this is to be found in Henry Holland's 1590 work, A Treatise Against Witchcraft. Here a dialogue between two characters named Mysodamon and Theophilus outlines that whilst actual transformations are contrary to nature and must be fables, witches may instigate these satanic delusions in those suffering from excessive melancholia. So, same thread again. Similarly, the somewhat lenient Puritan preacher George Gifford would write in his 1593 work a dialogue concerning witches and witchcraft that witches would delude mere melancholics into believing that they had turned into actual wolves. Others, such as the Protestant writer Johann Wehr, would attribute this not to the act of witches, but the direct influence of the devil in these individuals, whilst the Church of England cleric William Perkins believed the devil was capable of interfering with people's eyes to change the species of people that they beheld. So, with those general attitudes among scholars and some of the elites covered, for the rest of today's episode, I want to cover 3 of the more famous werewolf trials and claimed werewolf figures. The first case I want to cover is probably the most famous werewolf trial of this period, if only because it appears to have been the one that was most widely translated into English. It comes to us from Germany, and it is that of Peter Stump, with 2 P's, the Werewolf of Bedburg. This case took place between 1564 to 1589, and is most comprehensively known from a surviving English pamphlet published in 1590, that apparently came from a lost German original. This pamphlet purports to be a translation of the original trial documents, and my version again comes from a lycanthropy reader. There are a lot of disputes over this claim, however, that we'll get into, that it's a direct translation. In this tale, the accused is named as one Stub Peter, which is an alternative name that he is known by, who it claims for 25 years killed and devoured men, women, and children. Peter is described as having been greatly inclined to evil since his youth, who made a deal with the devil to receive a magic girdle, which when worn would allow him to take the form of a greedy, devouring wolf to savage his victims. He apparently hid his crimes by presenting a civil and comely appearance when he was out and about in the cities of Cologne, Bedburg, and a place that's spelled Cperadt, Seperad, or Pirad, which I could not liken to any modern settlement within the area of Cologne.
I know that there is a Swiss settlement, a Swiss city, where the name starts with an apostrophe, like apostrophe SP something, and I have no idea how you pronounce it. It might be an original version of that, I don't know.
Spirad or something, then it might be.
Something like that. Mm-hmm.
So comely was his appearance that he would even be unsuspectedly saluted by the family members of those that he had killed. Whilst on these trips, he would spy out his potential victims, then wait for them to leave the city where he might ravish them and cruelly murder them. Peter was also claimed to regularly kill sheep, lambs, and goats, to have taken many concubines, to have committed incest with his daughter Belle, and even to have murdered his own son, who was the product of incest. He was eventually captured and brought before the magistrates, where he was put on the rack and confessed to his crimes. He, his daughter Belle, and his lover Catherine Trompin were all pronounced guilty of the crimes or in aiding the crimes. The 2 women were burned alive, whilst Peter was executed in truly awful fashion. He was first tied to a wheel in Bedburg, where red-hot pincers were used to tear the flesh off his bones. His arms and legs were then broken with a wooden axe or hatchet, and finally his head was struck off and his body was burned. A high pole was then set up through the wheel that he was executed on, with a carved likeness of a wolf set into it, and his head was hung from the top.
That's overkill.
That's going above and beyond in your cruelty there, quite frankly. I don't think I've ever heard of an execution that cruel. Maybe the exception would be something like William Wallace's execution, which was pretty nasty. In the article, The Werewolf, the Witch and the Warlock, Willem de Blucourt argues that the pamphlet that purports to outline Peter Stump's case is one of the biggest contributing factors to the image of the murderous and cannibalistic European werewolf. This pamphlet was widely published throughout southern Germany, England and Denmark, and its status as the best-known werewolf story from the period that was published in English has led to it being dubbed the most celebrated European werewolf trial, as I said before. De Blucourt argues, however, that we should be cautious about this account, as there are no actual surviving trial sources in German, and the pamphlet appears to be instead constructed from a mixture of stories that circulated within the popular press about the crime. The only two contemporary accounts outside the pamphlet are that of a 1589 diary of a local pastor and a Dutch chronicler named Arnold van Buchel, who claimed to have met a man who witnessed the execution and stated that Peter had once been his servant. These do, however, replicate many core elements of the tale, noting the additional detail that throughout all of his murders and acts, Peter retained his soundness of mind. So there may well have been an actual werewolf trial, just perhaps one whose details became exaggerated in the retelling by other common claimed traits of werewolves from this period. Notably, despite the popularity of this pamphlet, it also doesn't seem to have sparked many further werewolf trials in any of the regions where it's widely read, so there is not a significant tradition of werewolf trials in England, southern Germany, etc. The second of these trials was that of the werewolf of Angers, A-N-G-E-R? Angers, sorry. I forget the last letter thing.
I visited there last summer.
Yeah.
It's really,
so the second
really nice city.
Yeah. So the second of these trials was that of the werewolf of Angers, the details of whose trial are largely known from the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's book, The Book of Werewolves from 1865, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in part 2 when discussing the literary development of the modern werewolf. According to this account in 1598, a group of men came across the corpse of a boy of 15, horribly mutilated and bespattered with blood. As the men approached, 2 wolves, which had been eating the carcass, turned and fled into a nearby thicket. There, shortly after, they found a half-naked man hidden in a bush. The man had long hair and a beard, long claw-like nails, and his hands were covered in blood and shreds of gore. The man stated of his own accord that he had killed the boy and partially devoured him, and that he had been interrupted by the men. He later proved to be a beggar named Jacques Roulet, maybe possibly, who had been lodged as a charitable case in the nearby village, but who had been missing for the last 8 days. When brought before the judges, he further claimed to be able to transform himself into a wolf using a salve which his parents had given him. So similar to the 2 cases I mentioned at the beginning of this section. He also identified the 2 wolves as his companions, John and Julian, though both were later found to have alibis that placed them far away from the scene. I believe his parents were also found to be respectable people with no connections to anything that he said. In prison, he behaved, quote, like an idiot, using the more medical sense of an idiot used from the time. And after initially being brought in with a distended and hard stomach, he drank a full pitcher of water and then refused to eat or drink. When quizzed by the judge, he gave confusing answers, variably claiming not to become a wolf but like a wolf, but also that his hands and feet became the paws of a wolf. Interestingly, unlike some of the other examples I mentioned before, he did not claim to have received his gift from the devil, which is otherwise a common running theme we've seen in these trials. He did, however, admit to killing and eating many other children, and for his crimes he was sentenced to death. I don't have much in the way of additional analysis to say about this case. It doesn't seem to have received much academic scrutiny. But I want to include an extra detail, which is this is a rare example of someone who was sentenced to death in a werewolf trial who had their sentence overturned. That's because he appealed his case to the Parliament of Paris, who declared that there was more folly in him than malice or witchcraft, and commuted his sentence to 2 years imprisonment in a madhouse. So if he did actually commit those crimes, that is a lenient sentence.
Yeah, he did some good convincing.
Yeah. Here they expected that he might be instructed in the knowledge of God, which he had, quote, forgotten in his utter poverty. The third and final of these trials I want to discuss is the affair of John Grenier, or Grenier it might be. Whilst this trial did not elicit much attention amongst the wider public at the time that it occurred, it later became more notorious due to a highly creative retelling of the text that was created by Sabine Baring-Gould. This version goes as follows. In it, a group of young village girls were out tending sheep not far from the Bay of Biscay. There they came across an emaciated boy with long red hair and an expression of terrible ferocity, who wore only tattered clothes and whose teeth are described as glittering white fangs. The boy told the girls that he was the son of the priest and that he would wear a wolf's skin sometimes, which was given to him by a demonic man named Pierre Lombard. When the skin was wrapped around Pierre, he claimed he would turn into a werewolf, that in this state he had killed dogs and drunk their blood, and that he had eaten many a maiden. This caused the girls to flee from him and to report him to the authorities. Around the same time, there was a 13-year-old girl named Margaret Poirier, who reported to her parents that she had been similarly harassed and later assaulted by a boy of the same name. She claimed that he had told her that he had acquired the powers of turning into a wolf, that he had killed and eaten many dogs and young girls, one of whom he claimed to have bitten to death. As for the assault itself, Poirier claimed that she had been attacked by a red-furred beast that resembled a wolf, that had torn her clothes on her left side with its sharp fangs, and that she had beaten it off with her staff. This was all reported to the parish authorities, and as it was known that a number of little girls had vanished in the area, Grenier was arrested and brought before the Parliament of Bordeaux in 1603. So there it quickly turned out that he was not a son of a priest, but instead that of a poor labourer. At the trial, he disputed some of the girls' claims. For example, he claimed only to have killed a single dog, whose blood he did not drink, as they claimed. However, he freely admitted to the girls' charge that he had transformed into a wolf and eaten children, claiming to have killed and assaulted a number of girls, and at least one boy who was whilst clothed in a wolf skin. He also claimed to have killed a baby that he found unattended in its crib, and that he had dragged it from its cradle and then eaten it. Interviews with the slain children's relatives corroborated his guilt in the matter, and then when presented with Margaret Poirier amongst a crowd of other girls, he identified her as a girl he had attempted to kill and eat on the basis of her wounds. As punishment for his crimes, he was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment in a monastery at Bordeaux, the court having taken pity on him for his tender age, the neglect of his upbringing, and his suffering from delusions and insanity. Upon arriving in the monastery, he apparently immediately ran around the cloister causing a ruckus on all fours, and upon finding a heap of raw offal, fell upon it and devoured it. He remained within the monastery for 7 years after the trial, dying eventually at the age of 20. So this version of the trial's events continues to be circulated in various werewolf articles, notably being included in a lycanthropy reader, where it's presented as a verbatim account without that much additional commentary. The reality, however, is that according to the article The Making of a Teen Wolf by Jan Mathielsen, the actual events surrounding Grenier's life and trial are much less understood than this account makes them seem. Baring-Gould's story is indeed based upon an account by a magistrate and witchfinder named Pierre de Loncre, that it is claimed was taken from Grenier in 1610, not long before his death, along with thorough study of the trial documents. However, it was also likely influenced by, and probably partially plagiarized from a relatively contemporary manuscript account that was likely written by a physician named John Filissac. Complicating things further, exactly how Filissac was involved with the trial is unknown. He was almost certainly not an eyewitness or present at the trial. Moreover, there are two other contemporary accounts by the Bordeaux Chronicle and one Bernard Autumnieu. By comparing the three versions, Jan Mathielsen argues a slightly different picture of events emerges. For a start, there had been a spate of known wolf attacks in the area prior to the 1603 trial, which had resulted in the deaths of multiple children, and one was even reported to have taken a baby from its crib. According to Mathielsen, the attack on Margaret Poirier had originally been reported as a suspected wolf attack with no connection to Grenier, though she did mention the distinguishing features which were later linked to him, like the red hair. The group of girls from the beginning of the tale had also encountered Grenier in the field several times before and were actually considerably older than him. MacLeod also argues that his claims may originally have been a boastful attempt to impress the girls, as he began apparently by claiming that he wasn't afraid of any wolves, and only later escalated his boast to having run with wolves and then later to the killing and the cannibalism. His seeming intimate knowledge of the attacks on children may also have been picked up by wandering around the region for the preceding month and a half in search of employment as a shepherd's boy, and he may have known of the various attacks he described in his trial by general word of mouth, and possibly he may even have seen some of these attacks himself as a shepherd. A minor note here, I haven't really gone into elsewhere. It wasn't uncommon during this period as well for shepherds to be accused of being werewolves, given their close association with flocks that were attacked. Records of the testimony given by Grenier and witnesses during reenactments and interrogations of the specific crimes also are often word for word identical, which is very suspicious. So I think there's enough there to say that there's justifiable suspicion that his confession wasn't as voluntary as some of these accounts claim. As to whether he actually committed any crimes, though, I honestly have no idea. So to turn to the topic of wider explanations for why these trials generally occurred, from what I've read, there seem to be a few obvious explanations for the cause of these trials. The first is similar to that of the witch trials, that these were simply individuals who it was convenient for one group or another within society to scapegoat. We should also take into account that this was a time of profound social and religious tension in the areas where werewolf trials were conducted, as it included, this time period included the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the French Wars of Religion, and the 30 Years' War, which led to widespread famine and destruction. This is also a period in which wolves appear to have done very well in the region, and so much of this may actually have been the result of just commonplace real wolf attacks that the authorities had to be seen to be doing something about. The prevailing atmosphere of distrust throughout this all, and superstition and desperation, quite likely could have led to convenient individuals therefore being blamed and accused as being werewolves. Another possibility is also that some of these figures may simply have been more conventional murderers or serial killers, whose actions led to them being accused of being werewolves, and the general climate of what a werewolf constituted at the time may have been mixed in with these actual crimes. So, over time, as with the wider European witch trials, werewolf trials gradually subsided throughout the 18th century. Werewolves, however, did continue to feature in folkloric tales in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and increasingly began to appear in popular fiction. It is in this literature that we see the seeds of the more modern figure of the werewolf that we're all familiar with today, and it is the development of this literary figure, along with other werewolf-like figures from around the world, that we're going to discuss in part 2.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah. So we're going to see the more modern werewolf emerge. Now, one thing I want to quickly say on the topic of ad breaks, on YouTube has done a thing recently that I wasn't aware of. Basically, they've changed it for a lot of accounts where if you turn on mid-roll ads, they just take control of that process now, to the best of my understanding. You don't have, to some extent, the same control over the process of timing out that you did. So we're just going to start cutting these ad break sections that we do for the podcast version and just let YouTube do whatever, because we don't have much control over that process anymore, unfortunately. We're also probably going to be putting out the individual parts of this episode as separate videos on YouTube going forward, and that's simply because I've been told that YouTube has kind of deprioritized some of these like really long compilation style videos that we were doing, like for Q Colon and for the Loch Ness Monster.
Does also help things be a bit more regular, as I know people do want the episodes a bit sooner, so it means we'll get this a bit sooner than we would if we'd done it in one big go. Yeah,
exactly. So if you're wondering why the episodes started being split up again on YouTube, that's why. So we're going to leave then just by saying, if you want to support the podcast any further, you can always head over to patreon.com/thehistocrat, or maybe it's _histocrat. I can never remember which was which. I think it's the histocrat in that case. You can also follow me over on Blue Sky. You can just find me under there as Histocrat or under my real name. And yeah, if you're listening to this on audio platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts or any other audio platform out there, you can also check out a video version over on YouTube on the Histocrat channel. There's plenty of additional aids on there for visuals as to how people would have depicted these creatures during the period. Other than that, I don't think there's any need for us to give a hint as to what the next episode is, because we just outright said it, because this is part 1.
Wait, what is it again? I've forgotten.
So that just leaves us to say thank you very much again.
Thank you for listening. Don't go anywhere. We're back for part 2.
Exactly. Okay. Hopefully in about a month's time. Have fun, folks.